time joining us, so welcome and thank you for providing us that information. So with that, let's get going. Quickly telling you a little bit about who I am and why I'm talking to you about this for those of you who are joining us for the first time. Like I said, my name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager here at the Waterwise Community Center. I have been a horticulture nut for about the last 15 years, really relentlessly pursuing understanding urban horticulture for Southern California, which has taken the form of doing horticulture work, horticulture management, including construction planning and construction management of landscapes. I have a master's degree in landscape architecture, and I've worked for a number of years in the public gardens world and then came to work at the Waterwise Community Center. And my real passion within that whole world, even though I've worked at the commercial scale, is really understanding how we can best utilize our urban spaces in all the forms it takes. And in a lot of Southern California, a lot of that area is suburban front yards and backyards. So I'm really fascinated with how we will be able to, whether it's working with professionals or where I get really excited is working with people on how do we do it ourselves? How do we create a transformation to a landscape that's going to be much more interesting and use a lot less resources in our urban areas? Quick question as we transition to what we will cover today. Carmen asked if this is going to be similar to the landscape transformation workshop. Mostly it's going to be quite different. There's just going to be a couple of slides that are similar, but this really goes into the construction and installation phase of things. So I guess this is a good opportunity to say that today we are going to focus on garden installation, garden establishment, and then hopefully we'll get to a bit of that from establishment to ongoing care, depending on how timing goes. This is kind of the last in an informal series of workshops that we have taught starting in the summer, where we've taught 3-hour topic-specific workshops on different aspects of design for gardens, different aspects of the plants for gardens in Southern California, different aspects of irrigation system design and installation. So we'll talk a little bit about irrigation today, but the last class that we taught, which is available on our YouTube page, is really all about irrigation systems, especially if you're converting from an old lawn irrigation system. And that's a whole class in itself that takes at least 3 hours. And so this is kind of the last part in that series. And now all of those are going to be available to watch online, where we are going to focus on the installation of the garden and that care throughout the first year, that really important establishment year. One thing to remember is that a garden is never truly done. A garden is different than redoing your living room and getting a new couch. And then, as long as it's treated well, it's just going to continue being that couch for year after year. A garden is truly a living system that's always evolving. And so things are kind of a moving target, and then there's always some sort of disturbance, and then you kind of adapt. But that's part of what's exciting about having a garden, and it makes the whole thing a lot more fun and a lot more interesting than your living room furniture in the long run. So just to set this out up front, and then we are going to jump into specific things. So for those of you who have joined us for the Landscape Transformation Basics workshop, this is the period where we'll go just to kind of set the tone through some of these basic same slides. But after a few minutes, it's all going to be totally different content. A lot of people want to know the general order of things when you're going to take on a garden project. And this is whether you're doing a whole yard or just a small area. And some of these, depending on your project, might not be relevant to you, but this is kind of trying to include most of it. Whatever the size of your project is, you always want to start with reflecting on what your goals are for that project, taking a good look at the site, the soil, thinking about your budget, and coming up with a design and whatever level of detail that is going to be for you, whether that's a fully drawn out 2-scale plan with exact plant counts, or just a general idea of what you're going to be doing with maybe some of the key plants. If you are going to be working with an outside contractor or landscaper, once you have your design and your budget thought about, talk to multiple contractors. You always want to get multiple quotes, check references. We talk more about this in the Landscape Transformation Basics workshop. This is really a DIY focused workshop. So if you're interested in a little bit more conversation about contractors, please check out one of our recordings of the Landscape Transformation Basic workshop on our YouTube page. If you are removing turf in Southern California and doing the turf removal rebate application, you want to do that as soon as you get your design figured out, because you can't start killing your turf until after you've received approval. Then you're going to want to kill your turf or remove your weeds, do whatever you need to do to generally prepare your site. If you're going to be digging like dry stream beds or moving soil, doing grading, which we'll talk about, that could be done as soon as you have killed your turf or have done your basic weed abatement, site preparation. If you have warm season grass like Bermuda grass, you really want to kill your turf during the late spring through early fall when that grass is actively growing. For more conversation on the turf killing, check out our Removing Your Lawn the Right Way workshop. Again, we're not really going to talk about that because getting into that could be its own 3 hours. So we're going to sort of start with the premise. We'll talk a little bit about weed abatement or how to make sure things don't grow back. But if you're really starting with the lawn, you'll want to check out that Removing Your Turf the Right Way workshop. And then you would do your primary irrigation system work. This might be all of your irrigation work that you need to do, depending on if you have a drip or a spray system. But definitely anything that deals with any trenching, piping, connections to anything underground, you want to do that before you do your planting. If you have a spray system, you're going to have all your work done. If you have a drip system, you might decide to put in some of the final drip work after you plant, so you know exactly where you need to run things. Then you're going to do your planting. That is best done in Southern California, late fall through early winter. I think about it as like a week or so before Thanksgiving through the new year, and definitely by the end of March, if at all possible. Plants planted in the late fall to very early winter that's really the sweet spot, because you'll get them in the ground and some of them will just take off right away. But some of them, you won't see much growth on top, but the roots will be getting settled in the ground, starting to spread out. And then when the heat of the spring comes on the other side of winter, things will be really ready to get going and grow well, but have a root system that could support it. If you plant in April, even though the weather's nice, the problem with April is that it's not that far away from June where we could have triple digits or high 90s. And so things just might not be as settled in. That being said, sometimes you just have to plant when you have to plant. But if it's at all possible, especially if you're doing a whole yard and you're new to this, planning on planting late fall, early winter is the best. If you are coming into this just starting to think about this right now, you still have turf grass that's in, you're starting to think about your design and just kind of do your research to understand things, you might be better set up to really take the process on, educating yourself, learning, taking time on your design, aiming to kill your turf next summer and then plant about a year from now. That wouldn't be too much. It's much better to do that and really have time for each stage. And then if you are installing a drip system, you might do your final irrigation system work immediately after planting, but be ready to do it right away. Then you do your mulching. Cleanup is really important. A nicely cleaned up yard after it's done makes all the difference in how good it looks and any final touches. And then you're going to be moving on to establishment care and enjoying watching your garden grow in. Now, I will say this is the ideal, perfect order of things. You will see in the main example that we go through later on, which is my backyard, that when this ideal order of things hits the real world, and we might be doing DIY projects a little bit at a time on the weekends, sometimes it gets a little bit more jumbled. and that's just fine. But I really want to provide this as a guide to how the general order of things should be planned out, if at all possible. So we're going to do a quick interlude about irrigation systems. And again, please check out our other irrigation classes to really get into it. But I didn't want to totally ignore it for this class, for those of you who are joining us with this class for the first time. One of the reasons why you need to plan irrigation work into your project, especially if you are converting from a lawn, is that the standard 4-inch lawn pop-up sprinklers aren't going to work for most designs of Waterwise or native gardens, because that little 4-inch or sometimes even just 2-inch pop-up sprinkler will almost always just spray directly into the side of the closest plant to it, which will get way too much water. And then most of the other areas will be very dry. So if you have a functioning irrigation system, you probably don't need to start from scratch. And you can probably use all of that pipe underground and do some conversion on the top, whether it's to drip or to a high efficiency spray system. So for a large yard, this is a picture of my young front yard, which you might recognize if you've joined us for other classes. For a large yard, I am a fan of working with high efficiency spray systems where either at the exact location, if it was a well-designed lawn irrigation system, or in many cases having to move a sprinkler or two, sometimes add an additional one, using all of that underground pipe, and then having these solid 2-foot risers with the high efficiency rotating spray nozzles right on top of it. The reason why I like doing that is because usually for a large size planting in a residential situation, it's going to be less work and lower cost than establishing a good drip system that's going to last and is going to work well. It's almost as, quote, efficient as drip, which means getting the water where you're actually intending to get it instead of it running off or blowing away in the wind. The high efficiency rotating nozzles are much better than traditional spray nozzles at getting the water to the soil where it's intended to go. And Waterwise plants, unlike a lawn, don't need perfectly even coverage. That distribution uniformity is the term, is really important for a lawn where you'll rapidly get brown spots in the summer if that water isn't perfectly distributed, because the root systems are shallow, the plants need a lot of water regularly. With Waterwise plants, if things aren't perfectly even, but as long as that water is getting to your soil, those plants have those big root systems that are going to search out and find that water. Spray systems generally are easier to turn on every once in a while, quickly check and make sure that there's no leaks and maintain. And if something does blow apart and there's an issue, usually it creates a big mess right away, so you can catch it and fix it. Where drip systems, sometimes if there's damage or a line that's cut, you don't notice until maybe months later, where the plant health starts to be affected and you've maybe wasted a lot of water, kind of undermining some of that efficiency from the drip system. And then finally, although I do believe that it's perfectly possible to grow California native plants with a drip system, just as choosing one as a default, they are often easier and a little healthier with overhead spray irrigation that more mimics the rain. However, those spray systems don't work well for planted areas that are less than 10 feet wide or oddly shaped, because you'll overspray onto pavement usually. And then you see the sprinklers, but once the garden grows in, they're not necessarily noticed. If you're doing those high efficiency spray systems, definitely check out our turf to high efficiency irrigation system workshop that we just did. And that will kind of walk you through the process of how to do that. You're going to want to complete all that work ideally before planting, if you can. If you're going to be working with drip, this is the kind of drip system that you want to be using. You don't want to be using those individual button emitters that go on that 1/4-inch spaghetti tube stuff where there's all the little different doodads that you put together. Those systems might be great in theory, but in the long term, Waterwise and native plants want their root systems to grow far and wide, and that's where they want to get the water. And with those little button systems, what you end up with is 1 or 2 emitters just right at the base of the plant. Technically, you're supposed to move those out and add more and more emitters as the plant grows, but nobody ever does. And also, those things almost always fall apart over time and go unnoticed. We just never see them in good situations when we do site visits or irrigation system audits. So this, which is called inline drip line, where each emitter, these are not just holes, but these are engineered emitters, is embedded in at a regular spacing, usually 1 foot. That's the way you want to go. And there's fittings that put the line together in different orientations. Here's kind of the engineering of the emitter for one brand. And for a large area, you literally make a grid, and it's literally as if it rained by the time the water continues to spread out underneath the ground a little bit. It's just not going through the air. So for a large system like this, it's perfectly viable. And I've done projects very successful like this, but it's kind of a lot of material. It's a lot to keep up with on the maintenance. Depending on the planting plan, this very well might be the only efficient way to go. But for small areas like this, makes absolute complete sense. And this is the only approach I would take for a small area like this. If you have an area where pathways mix in, you can definitely not have drip underneath those. And that would be a viable approach as well. So for also how to design and install these systems, check out that same class. Question just came in from Whitney. Can you still just use a hose with a spray attachment? Absolutely. Depending on the scale of your landscape, you can just use a hose with a spray attachment. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. I want to provide you some tips for doing that to be successful. And so we'll get into that, because what we find is that most people water too often and not deep enough with the hose if they do that. But yeah, the main area that I'm going to show you as our kind of case study for this, which is part of my backyard, that's all California native plants, I water it with a hose. For people who want to be involved in their garden on a very regular basis, that is definitely workable and can be a very efficient way to water. If you're doing a drip grid system, you can choose to either complete everything before planting. And if you are doing this for the first time, that's a pretty good way to go, because that way you won't get stuck with that part taking longer than you thought it would before you, if you plant before you do that, it takes longer than you thought it would, especially if you have to go, a couple of weekends, then you can be kind of left behind scrambling to keep your plants watered by hand. But if you kind of feel like it's a small area, or you know what you're doing, sometimes it is more convenient to plant first, because then you could plant exactly where you want. And then if the lines need to move a little bit around a plant, that's just fine. So you can go either way on that. But if you are doing the drip grid, you want to make sure that everything, all the attachments, all the connections to the pipe in the ground are complete. And the only thing you would maybe wait on would be running those last drip lines. So with that, now we're going to turn to just kind of step by step going through that installation process. First part in the garden installation. If you've joined us for our design classes or our landscape transformation basics class, we talk a lot about goals. So the first thing you want to do every stage of the process, revisit your goals for your project and revisit your design in whatever level of detail that is. So if you have a fully laid out plan, you're going to want to bring that plan out, start marking out exact plant locations, be out there maybe with a tape measure doing that. If you have a more just kind of general plan where you haven't identified each planting area, but kind of here's where I'm going to have this tree, then I'm going to have these shrubs nearby, you can kind of feel that out as you go. But remember, revisit your goals and keep looking at things. You can always change things, even from a drawn out plan, as you start to lay things out, and you probably will. So the main example we're going to look at today is my and my partner Kyra's backyard. And we started looking at the property where we live now in about April 2018, and started installation later. So we'll kind of go through that. Still a pretty new planting, still growing in. And so here were our guiding goals for that landscape. We wanted to provide habitat for us, people, but especially also birds, insects, and lizards. So insects being pollinators and butterflies mostly, but also caterpillars and other little beetles and critters that are going to be food for the birds. So it was pretty driven to be, we want it to be a beautiful garden for us and a habitat garden. We wanted to have a very diverse collection of California native plants. We are both professional horticulturists. So normally when I talk about design, I encourage people not to plant too many different plants. For us specifically, one of our goals for the backyard was to have a very diverse collection of California native plants. So this kind of specifically for our goals kind of broke from that rule. And so as we are thinking about design, we're thinking about how do we have this very diverse collection and still have things have a nice coherent look. We needed to fix some drainage issues on the site. And in doing that, we also wanted to capture and infiltrate water, both to help give our garden a good soak, even in a small rain, and also to, over time, help recharge the groundwater table. We wanted to add visual interest to the yard. And we knew that in creating our collection of native plants, we still didn't want it to just be one of this and one of that and one of this and one of that. So we wanted to have different areas for different plant community feelings. So areas that would have chaparral plants, areas that would have desert plants, an area that would be kind of meadowy. And as opposed to working with a professional client or what I would do in my work at the Waterwise Community Center, or even what we did with our front yard, where we had a very specific plan, had plant counts and layouts for the backyard, it was going to be a little bit looser. We wanted to kind of build it like a sculpture. So where we'd have ideas, but then we would also kind of do some shopping around, look at plant availability lists, and kind of build it as we went over time. And that's a perfectly viable way to do things as well. So if putting everything down on graph paper and drawing it out is intimidating to you, you don't necessarily need to totally do that. I will say for a first-time gardener, doing that drawing gives you a better chance of success. If you've been doing it for a long time, you sort of develop the ability to kind of look at an area and kind of see it, but you can kind of build it as you go. It's your site and you can do what you want. So that's what we did for the backyard. So this is the site, April 2018. We had a wedge-shaped lot in Pomona, California. And there had been some old trees that were literally kind of seedlings that had just been left to grow for many years. There's a couple of small patches of lawn, but most of the yard had been kind of abandoned for a long time. And the trees were not in good condition. In fact, they were actually hazardous. And so we were able to fortunately leave native coast live oak tree, but the rest of the trees were in the process of either causing damage to wall foundations or structurally unsound. So after working with some arborists, we actually ended up removing most of the trees. And then we're going to be planting a great garden and replanting trees as well. So some sacrifice, but then in the long run, it's going to be happier and a much safer area. So you can see all of the damage caused to this concrete patio, which we felt was not only unsafe over here, but much larger than we needed it to be. So this is November 2018. We had moved in October, and this is kind of what we were starting with. You can see the first thing we did was put up our bird bath, and the birds already started to come, even just with this. So bird bath and a little bit of mulch around it. And so with your goals, maybe a plan, some sort of plan, maybe a full-on design. Again, for that design part, going to be referring back to our design classes. You're going to start to look at site preparation for you to be able to do your work. So different aspects of what I consider this first round of site preparation. If there's turf, is it dead? If you have weeds, are those weeds under control? What's going to be your plan for that? Oftentimes there's just some digging things out or weed abatement that needs to happen. Taking on irrigation work as necessary. After that, you're going to be looking at site layout round one. And so that would be layout of paths, patios, grading, moving soil around, water capture features, figuring out where your largest, most permanent plants, your trees are going to be. etc. So if you're going to be doing a lot of installing paths, a lot of moving soil, digging out a dry stream bed or something like that, you might not be doing all of your irrigation work first, but you might find that it's going to be easier to, for example, if you need to run a new main line, you might want to do that work. If you know a path is going to go through a certain area, you might want to dig underneath where that path is going to be and install an extra large pipe, like a 2-inch diameter pipe that you can snake your line through underneath without having to disturb your path. So you're going to be thinking about number 2 and number 3 at the same time and deciding based on your personal site, what's going to be that best order of operations to make the least work for you in the long run. So you're not having to redo things, but you're not missing opportunities. And so we're going to look some at some different layout techniques. And then after you have that layout, that's when you're actually going to be doing your soil moving, or if you have really compact soil and you need to dig some areas just to loosen it up, that's when you would do it. After the soil is in the right place, that's when you would do any of your what's called hardscape construction. Are you going to be putting in paths or patios or anything like that? After that's done, then you would do most of your irrigation work. Then a final site cleanup, pre-planting. So offcuts of pipe, crumbled chunks of concrete that you dug up out of the ground as you were doing things, just any rocks that got dug up, maybe putting them off to the side. You'll be bringing them back later, maybe as an ornamental kind of thing, but just anything that you need to do to get things ready for then your round 2 of layout, which would be in this kind of roughed in garden that's not planted yet. Then you're going to lay out your plants. But in general, you're going to want to do as much of this other work as you can and planting at the end. For a professional landscape project where you're going to be kind of doing it all at once, or a crew is going to be coming in and doing it all at once, you almost always do all that other stuff and plant at the very end. It protects your plants, make sure they can start getting watered right away. Sometimes in our home projects, things get a little bit more mixed up, but again, this is the ideal that you want to shoot for. So in part of our plan, we had decided really early on that we wanted to just get rid of about 1/3 of this patio space. It was really broken significantly, and it was just more paving than we needed. So I'm going to be showing you some things that for some of you, it would maybe be a DIY project. For some of you, it definitely wouldn't be. Some of you are going to be more concerned with planting because you have no problems with your patio spaces. Some of you might. So just kind of pick and choose from this what's going to be relevant to you. But just wanted to show the process for this particular case study. So you can see this picture is being taken in the evening because rented the jackhammer from Home Depot, or the breaker, kind of mini jackhammer, and was paying by the day. So I wanted to get it done. So broke all of this up, which is quite a bit of work. Definitely need a good back to be taking it on as a DIY project, but is doable if you do have a good back and are motivated to do so. And what we decided to do is, both for budget and also for the look that we were going to be happy with, we kind of just broke up and controlled the edge and we still wanted a paved area here since it was already here. If we were starting from scratch, we'd put in something that was permeable, maybe flagstone or with gravel in between or something like that. But since we already had this here, it was going to be a useful work surface. And so we wanted to keep part of it and break up most of the rest of it. I see that somebody had raised their hand. For those of you who were not with us at the beginning, for the flow of what works well for these workshops, please type your questions into the Q&A and we will get to them in between different sections as we go. We're not going to actually stop and call on people. So yeah, please, if you have anything, type it into the Q&A. And then in certain other areas, we had problems to solve. So I mentioned that we had drainage issues on the site. And one of the things that would happen, there's a slight slope from the front yard to the backyard. And with this concrete walk through here, this whole area and this whole planter would just flood, even in a small rain. And so we broke out the path through here and came up with a plan to allow water to come through by replacing this area with some large stepping stones, which you'll see later. And so this is December 2018, taking a break just to contemplate what was going to be happening. And so this is an area that we had decided that we were going to take some of those larger pieces of broken concrete and create a separate patio space that would be permeable to the rain by working that broken concrete back in. So taking a step as we were going just to envision how it would all come together. So whether you're building it like a sculpture in the field or just transposing a drawn out plan into the real world, you are rapidly going to get into that phase of laying out your garden that I talked about. And there's a few tools that I consider to be really essential to making that process as painless as possible. That being said, if you're working on a very low budget, use whatever you have. You don't have to go to the hardware store and get all of this exact stuff, scratch stuff into the ground, use rocks, do whatever you want just to create markings out there. But these are some of the common tools that I find make the process very easy. So these are irrigation flags. You can get them at the hardware store. Sometimes at the hardware store, they're a lot more expensive than the landscape supply specialty store, like the place where you get irrigation stuff. Almost every city has a number of them, and you can normally get these in like packs of 100 in different colors. If you're doing a small residential yard, you might only need one pack. I think they end up costing like 10 cents each. But then if you have all of one color, you can write on these with Sharpie. So if you're labeling different plants or corners of a pathway or whatever, you can label out there so you don't just put a bunch of flags out and then have trouble remembering what they were for later. Here we have what are called grade stakes from the hardware store. And they come in different lengths. I'll often, if I'm going to get a pack, just go for a 3-foot length because I can use those for a variety of different things. Sometimes the small ones, once you hit them into the ground, there's not much sticking up above the ground. If you're going to be hitting stakes into the ground, you need something to drive those stakes into the ground. And the normal tool for doing that is a 4-pound sledgehammer, which is this thing. 4 pounds just happens to be the weight of it. And then you're going to have a tape measure of some sort. Any tape measure will do. If you have to buy a tape measure for the project because you don't have a decent tape measure, you can buy them in either a 25 or a 30-foot length, and there's not that much of a cost difference. For landscape uses, go for the 30-foot length. It's surprising how often that extra 5 feet comes in handy once you're out on a landscape. And then you're going to want something where you can kind of draw out on the surface of the soil or the mulch. And my favorite thing for that is just a old bag of all-purpose flour, if you have it. Sometimes people buy like gypsum at the agricultural supply store, but most people have just an old, slightly out-of-date bag of flour around, and that's just fine as well. Works very well. And then if you have a larger landscape area, these longer tape measures tend to be very useful. For most residential sizes, unless you have kind of a rural lot, 200 feet is probably longer than you need. 100-foot tape measure is really useful. And especially if you're going to be doing garden layout by yourself, things are usually easier with 2 people. But if you are going to be doing it by yourself for a landscape project, I really like these 100-foot tapes because it's a kind of soft, almost cloth-like with a thin layer of plastic over it, fiberglass tape. So it's different than the metal tape measures. It's flexible. They don't kind of flop around as much. And you can actually use a screwdriver, and they come with a loop on the end. So if you're trying to get a measurement by yourself, instead of trying to keep it balanced with a metal tape measure, you can use the screwdriver as a little stake through the end of it, and then just pull your tape and then pull your measurements. And so this is just a random example from our demonstration garden at the Waterwise Community Center, just showing some of the layout techniques. And so you might use, your layout might be an informal garden, it might be a more formal garden. This is just one example to show some of the techniques. And this was going to be laying out an area where we are going to have some raised beds. And so it's a little bit more of a formal layout. And so we had our main measurement, and then we wanted to pull off kind of at a right angle from the existing pathway. And so there are ways that you can use to lay out a perfect square by doing multiple measurements. But for most backyard purposes, easy way to do it without having to do much math is you can have your, if you start with a normal straight line, I am always using my builder's square, which is another thing just from the hardware store, which is useful for getting quick measurements, but also is just a perfect right angle. And so you can align it and then just kind of pull out your secondary measurements from there. Then I'm using flags and stakes to mark whatever I need to. I'll often, if I'm laying out straight lines, I'll use that 100-foot tape. I'll figure out where the start and the end of that line needs to be. And then I'll pull that tape along it. And then once I have it in the right situation, I'll trace it with that bag of flour, just kind of sprinkling it at a time, a little bit at a time. And so you can see here our layout starting to take shape. And so I'm not going through these slides to tell you anything about this particular layout, but really just to kind of show you the tools, the parts you might use, the process. And so here you can see us doing all of that to get our kind of formal shape. Here's another example, doing round shapes. So instead of right angles, same stakes used in the middle, or if you have a metal stake or anything like that. And then I'll just go to the hardware store and get either some rope or some sort of strapping. And if you're trying to do circular layouts, you can start with something pounded into the ground as like a central hub. I'll often, if I have my 100-foot tape measure, I'll often use the screwdriver right in the middle. And then I know if I want a circle where the radius is like 5 feet, then I'll put that screwdriver in the middle. If you're going to be pulling it for something perfect, it's really useful to have somebody secure that screwdriver. And then as I go right at that 5-foot mark, for example, I'll sprinkle that flour. And then in this case, we're going to have a pathway. So we go out to our larger measurement, still starting from that same part in the hub, and get those larger arcs, and then go from there. So hopefully that is useful. Essential tools are really important as well. Really making sure you have the right tool for the job will, one, make the job possible, but in many cases, make your life much easier. I've definitely gone to help people install their residential gardens before. And for example, they'll pull out a square point shovel to start digging holes for a plant. And that's just, depending on the soil type, either not going to work or make it 10 times harder and much more exhausting than it should be. So the right tool for the job is really going to set you up for success. And in terms of just shovels, local hardware store is generally going to have something that's just fine. So your normal digging shovel needs to be one of the pointed types. Sometimes they're called a spade traditionally. Usually these days you see them referred to as a digging shovel or sometimes a round point shovel, even though it's not quite round. And it sometimes is you get what you pay for. If you're going to go to a hardware store, or especially one of the big box stores, and get a shovel, usually they'll have super cheap, mid-range, and then the most expensive one. The super cheap one is usually a piece of junk. It might break on you in the first job that you're doing with it, is not built to last, and usually the metal is not great either. If you can, skip that one. This is an example of a mid-range one, which in most cases is usually just fine. And I will often go for the fiberglass handle. They tend to just be more durable as long as you put them up in a shed or a garage when you're done. You don't want to leave the fiberglass out in the sun every day. And you don't want to leave your tools out anyways. If you clean them when you're done and put them up, they're going to last you much, much, much longer and perform better. And also, take them off the shelf and take a look at them and feel them. So, for example, from the hardware store where you can get this particular shovel, this is the mid-range one, and the more expensive one is great, but it's also quite a bit heavier. So depending on your body, your level of strength, you also might not want to get the most expensive one. Might be heavier than is comfortable for you. So this is your normal digging shovel, your spade. Also very useful, depending on your project, is a square point shovel. This is meant for moving material. So filling a wheelbarrow if you have a loose pile of soil, moving gravel, moving decomposed granite, any of those sorts of things, moving a pile of something, but not digging into the ground, or emptying out a wheelbarrow as well. So moving loose piles of things, you can just scoop up a lot more. And then if you are trying to do an even layer of something on the ground, or kind of touch up like some grading to where you're trying to get an area to be a little bit flatter, you can use this for it. Your round shovel is not going to set up flat areas very well at all. So this is the square point shovel. If you're trying to flatten out an area as well for kind of final work, you can also kind of use this almost like a broom to just kind of do that final touch up. Other essential tools, both for moving soil after you've gotten the bulk of your soil in place with one of your shovels, to kind of flatten out, or even on a curved surface or a mounded surface, get that final soil to be exactly where you want it. Also really essential for laying out mulch. If you are dumping wheelbarrows of either wood chip or gravel mulch, is the bow rake. So this is a solid metal rake, different than a spring rake or a normal leaf rake, and can move a lot of material around. Does it much more efficiently than if you're trying to use, for example, a shovel. And also, same thing with the shovels at the hardware store. Usually the cheapest one is a piece of junk, and then there's the mid-range and the higher range one. Sometimes the width of the rake is a little bit different, and sometimes that higher end one is going to be wider than the mid-range one. So take a look at it. The difference between something that's 16 inches wide and 18 inches wide, if you're going to be doing a whole yard, is sometimes quite a bit of difference if you're going to be using this thing for hours. And then final tool we'll talk about, just talking about these long-handled tools. If you're going to be using wood chip mulch, some sort of fork to get that mulch from a pile into a wheelbarrow is really important. And my fork of choice is a Tine Bedding Fork, which is the one that looks like this. Sometimes people will use the pitchforks, which are a little bit less wide and just has the 4 tines. Depending on the type of mulch you have and where it's coming from, sometimes those work great, but sometimes the mulch just falls in between the tines because they are too far apart. So this is generally my go-to because it will work with pretty much any type of mulch that I've ever used, depending on the texture and the grind. Sometimes the local hardware store will have this. Sometimes you need to order these online, but you can normally get them from somewhere that will have free shipping. So it shouldn't cost you an arm and a leg. People's budgets are different. So what I want to say is, don't feel like if you're putting in a few plants and doing a couple of planting beds with mulch, you don't necessarily need to go and buy this tool. But if you're doing a large project and you're creating your budget for the project and you're going to be working on it every weekend for a long time or something like that, if you have the ability to invest in some decent tools, it will make your work much more efficient and it will be more pleasurable to do the work. Last mention of tools. If you are doing a larger project to where you do need to buy a wheelbarrow, I highly, highly encourage you, From the hardware store, some of the wheelbarrows you can get come with a solid or flat free tire, which is one that's filled with like a solid rubber and not an inflated tire. If it's in your budget, go for the one with the flat free tire. Wheelbarrow tires are just notorious for deflating, and oftentimes you can't get them to inflate again on the same rim. And so you're having to buy a new rim and a new tire each time, especially if they're the kind of thing where you might use it seasonally and then put it up, bring it back the next year to do some stuff. You're just going to have so much less downtime and often less cost in the long run than replacing the pneumatic inflatable tires time after time. So with that, essential tools out of the way, but very important, we're going to talk a little bit about patios and pathways. Because we're covering a lot today, this is not going to necessarily tell you every single thing you need to know about building a patio or a pathway. That's a kind of more advanced DIY project, but I did want to talk about it some, show some of the materials, show some of the tools. And then if you're really going to try to do it yourself, you can follow up from this on doing some other research online. There are lots of YouTube videos and articles online about how to do this sort of stuff. One of the reasons why is that the techniques for doing this sort of stuff is kind of the same everywhere in the country, whereas some of the specific planting techniques for Waterwise gardens are more regional and harder to find specific information on online. So I know like DIY Network and some of those other online sources have a lot of follow-up information that can give you more specifics. And so this is the area that we decided we're going to take some of the extra concrete from breaking up that patio, and we're going to put in a broken concrete seating area here. And then we were going to develop garden in the rest of it to create a bit of a sense of separation between those two areas. And so one of your first tools that's useful for a lot of landscape work is called a line level. And that is a level specifically meant to hang on a line. And so instead of only being able to level like 2 feet or 4 feet at a time, if you want to look across a wide area, you can hit in stakes on either side. You will use the line that it's meant to be used on is called mason string. And you can get that at the local hardware store. It's the neon stuff. It comes on a reel, and it's meant to be unrolled and then re-rolled back in. So you don't need to be cutting it off each time you use it. And you'll tie it to one side securely. And then roughly halfway in between the two stakes, you hang this little level on it. And it just works like the bubble levels, like all the other ones, where there's the two lines and you want the bubble to be centered. And usually using it's a 2-person job. So one person will stay where the level is and keep an eye on it. And the other person will go to the other stake and kind of raise it and lower it at the other stake until the person looking at the level in the middle confirms that it's level. You want to be pulling it pretty tight to make sure you have a nice tight straight line. And then when it's level, you will wrap at that level the line around the stake some a few times to tighten it down, and then maybe give it a loose tie as well. And then what you can do is you can use that as a guide. If you're trying to level an area, you can measure down from where the string is with the measuring tape. And for example, if at this stake, you measure down and your measurement is 6 inches, and at this stake, you measure down and your measurement is 4 inches, you'll know that the soil over here is a full 2 inches taller than the soil over there. And so you're going to have to cut some soil down out of this area if you want to be level across the whole top. And one of the nice things about this line level is then you can come with your measurements at any point along here and get a really good sense, not just of 2 points at the end, but what you need to do everywhere along that line. Also, if you're working on then laying patio stones, other levels very important. 24-inch or a 2-foot level is going to be really useful, kind of making sure that things are level in between individual pieces of either broken concrete or flagstone. Also, sometimes useful, it would be a 4-foot level in the landscape as well, but not as essential. And then if you want to, not using the string level, but just using a level you can really quickly lay out, kind of extend the utility of like a 2-foot level over a really large area, a piece of 2x4 lumber that's in good shape, so you know it's not warped. You can lay that down and then just lay the 2-foot level on top of it, and it kind of extends the function of it. And so here is the area. We used that line level and raked and moved soil, used that flat shoveled soil, and then also tamped it down a bit to compact it as much as possible. So this is a manual tamper. It's basically a heavy metal plate on a stick, and you want to, basically when you use them, you're kind of just dropping with some force to compact over time. And you're not going to get a whole lot of compaction just on loose soil, but it's enough to kind of settle things in some. They really shine when you're compacting like road base as a layer underneath a gravel or decomposed granite pathway, a substrate that's meant to be compacted. And so with road base, there's looser and more gravelly particles, and then finer particles like sands, and they're really meant to compact together. So if you need to do compaction for just a small area, you would use a tamper. Commercial jobs tend to use a vibrating plate, which is a heavy piece of gas-powered machinery, but those things are so heavy that normally you need a piece of equipment like a tractor or a bobcat to even move them into place. If you are working with a tamper, just be careful. Work mostly with your legs. It's really easy if you're doing a large area to exhaust your back if you're not being careful with your posture, and if you're using your back instead of your legs. And then if you are going to then be laying down a flagstone or broken concrete as pavers, a really useful tool is a Deadblow Hammer. If you have a rubber mallet around, you can use that instead as well. A Deadblow Hammer will work in a similar way, but there's, depending on the style of the hammer, either a loose sand or some metal like little BBs inside, and you don't get as much kickback. It just transfers the force down, but in a way that's less destructive than like using a sledgehammer that might crack the stone. And so as you do that, basically you're settling that stone into a kind of a loose base. So in this case, what I did is, starting from that pretty settled base, I would work up with my bow rake just a little bit of a loose soil right where I was going to be putting down the next few pavers. And having that just little bit of loose soil lets them kind of settle in, especially with the broken concrete. It's not always flat on the bottom. So it is sometimes a process of, if you're using broken concrete, pushing some soil back kind of underneath, making sure things are settled, and then using that hammer to kind of smack things down. And then with broken concrete, you could use decomposed granite to fill in between the cracks. In this case, I just use soil, or you could use gravel. But one caution with gravel in between flagstone or decomposed granite is that can sometimes work its way back onto the surface of the pavers, and that could be a slip hazard depending on the size of your gravel. So for here, we just used soil and then had a bunch of wildflowers growing between those cracks afterwards, which is kind of nice. It's a little bit wild looking, but it's what we like. And so you can see here, this is when it's done. This, again, would be an advanced DIY project or something to hire a landscaper to help with. The concrete is heavy. You can see I'm wearing my back brace when I do this, because normal concrete, when you break it up, it's great to use recycled material. It is 4 inches thick. And so even a piece like this is quite heavy. For the larger pieces, I'd actually bring them pretty much in place with a dolly. For the smaller pieces, I just move them around. And whether it's flagstone or broken concrete, you're kind of creating a mosaic with smaller pieces, kind of picking a piece at a time, smaller pieces going between larger pieces. To me, creating this and wanting to use the concrete was also a way of keeping material that I needed to get rid of out of the landfill, and also not paying for the cost to dump all the material. So I personally was pretty motivated to use the broken concrete, and I like the look. And so that was that when it was done. For patios and things like that, some examples from some other sites. Looking at decomposed granite. So here, same thing. We were setting up a nice base layer. For decomposed granite, which is, I'm realizing that I didn't put in a picture of decomposed granite at the beginning, so apologize for that. So if people are wondering what it is, decomposed granite is that stuff. You see it in pathways at a lot of public parks where it's supposed to be a little bit more natural. And then in residential situations, if you want a permeable space and you're putting in something new, can be great for a pathway or a patio. One caveat is that I don't encourage people to have an only decomposed granite patio right outside their house. You probably want an area, if you are going to have a decomposed granite patio, that's at least a transition spot with some pavers, maybe some flagstone or a concrete area, because once this is compacted, it is very firm, but you can, and it has a nice crunch. It's firmer than gravel, but it's almost like being out on gravel. But some of the particles from this can get stuck in your shoes. And if you have something like this right next to going into your house, sometimes there can be issues with tracking it in. Additionally, when it rains, it can get kind of muddy and it will harden after the rains are gone. But walking through it in the middle of the rain can make the surface kind of muddy. You can put footprints into it. And then when it dries, you would kind of have to scrape it apart again because it'll dry with those footprints. And so if you do have a patio area that you know you're going to be walking through when it rains, through a section, you might embed flagstones or pavers through it. And that can be your walking path when it rains. So now we'll go back and we'll look at the process. So working with a patio like this or an area like this, one of the things that I like to do to kind of guide me for exactly how much soil I need to remove is put your edging in first. So if you are doing something that is like decomposed granite, usually you're going to have some sort of edging that will hold it all in and allow you to compact it, keep it from spilling out into the soil. I am really a fan of using steel or metal edging, which is available from your local landscape supply specialty store. You're not going to find it at Home Depot or Lowe's because it holds in place really well. It's very durable, and the staking system for holding it down just works better than like the plastic edging. It also looks much nicer over time. It is harder to work with and it's more expensive. You don't want to use it for small areas because it's not that flexible. And then if you need to cut it, it normally is a little bit more of an advanced DIY kind of thing because you would want usually a power tool like a Sawzall or a 4-inch angle grinder to cut this. So if you already are like a tool person and you have those tools, that's how you would do it. You can use like a metal hacksaw, just manually hacksaw with a metal cutting blade. It's going to take quite a bit of work. But if you can do it, that's going to give you a really, really nice long-lasting edge. And once you have that edge set up, and for example, across here, the slope went down this way. So we're allowing for a slight slope this way, but we wanted it to be level across here. We set this level by pulling that line level from side to side with a couple of stakes, and then making sure we kind of ended up digging a little trench through here, making sure that this edging was level, and then digging down as we needed. So we would get 2 to 3 inches of fill for our level of decomposed granite. And that's really what it needs. If you're trying to do it really like top-notch commercial style, you would actually dig out extra. You would put in 2 to 3 inches of road base underneath that you would compact and then the decomposed granite. But for most smaller kind of backyard residential DIY projects, if you have not super loose soil, you can just compact the soil, rake things out, get out your rocks. So we wet it, we just kind of tamped it down some, and then put down a weed cloth, a permeable weed cloth barrier here, with a nice overlap everywhere where you need it to go between sheets. That's a roll. If you're doing a larger patio space, you're going to want to get it or order it through the landscape supply store. You can get much wider rolls than you can like at Home Depot. It's going to be better quality stuff that'll last longer as well. I never use this stuff in the garden for weed control. It doesn't work well long term, but underneath a permeable patio like this does work well. Then we are bringing out our decomposed granite and raking it into an even layer using those bow rakes primarily to do so. When you order decomposed granite, you can order it either with or without something called stabilizer. For a pathway or a patio, you want to get it with the stabilizer. It's more expensive, but that is what's going to allow you to compact it and have it really hold well. If you are ever using it as like a mulch, putting a couple inches of it to cover the soil in a landscape area, you want to use it without the stabilizer. That's what's going to keep that permeable. And then from there, doing the compaction. So if you're going to be compacting decomposed granite, you would need it to be moist, but not wet. So kind of hitting it with the hose, letting it soak in some. And then here, this is that vibrating plate, but you can also use a hand tamper. It will just take you a long time. This vibrating plate, it's very, very heavy. I mean, it's like four high school kids who we were working with could barely drag this thing. And that was just to get it to the bucket of the tractor to move it over, because it's the weight that makes it work. There's a lot of steel in it to make it heavy. So that's it. And that's it when it's done. And all of that same stuff works for pathways as well. So here's an example of a pathway. This edging here is the plastic edging, which you can get at the hardware store or the landscape supply store. The advantages of the plastic edging is that it's very easy to work with, very easy to cut, and it's cheaper. But it is also harder to lay it out in a perfectly straight line if that's what you need. And the staking system for this stuff is kind of inadequate long term. Oftentimes after a few years, the stuff starts to kind of heave out of the ground, and it's pretty hard to fix. And so that is really why I prefer the metal edging, if at all possible. Or you can kind of see here, even brand new installation, and it's not perfectly straight. You just can't get it perfectly straight. Or you can also use just river rock as the edge, as we're about to look at. Or you can just use plain old gravel for a patio. This aesthetically is my favorite look, easiest to put in. And what you want to do is just make sure you don't go too thick with the gravel, because it'll feel like walking in sand if you do. Also, if you have family or friends in a wheelchair, the thinner the gravel layer, making sure you do some nice compaction underneath, the easier it'll be to get through it. If you have like 2 inches of gravel, of pea gravel, it starts to get very hard to roll a wheelchair through. But I really love the look of this. And then it just kind of washes out into kind of mixing with the surrounding landscape. Some of the plants are actually planted in the gravel. Price is right, easy to put in, don't need any edging. I think this is a lovely way to go. And so here you can see here an example of the decomposed granite pathway, just using river rock as the edging. And I think this is absolutely lovely. Just one tip if you're doing this is that you need to kind of take some care on some of the rock to like dig it in part way. And then it's going to take some detailed kind of compaction work at the end. You might come back with a little like hand tool because the tamper can't get all the way to the rocks. Sometimes using something like the back of a hammer, just like that stick part of it, to kind of pack things in around the rock. Or here we have gravel path with this edge. With the gravel path, you have a choice about what to do underneath it. If you really want to make sure you're not going to have to do any weeding, then that weed barrier is useful. However, because the gravel shifts around more than the decomposed granite, you might need to come back and rake the gravel every so often, because you start to see some of that weed barrier underneath sometimes. If you have a quite weedy site, I would encourage you to do that, because if you just put down gravel over soil, Quite a lot of weeds can come up through that, and you don't want to have to spend a lot of time weeding a gravel path. I've had gardens where I have to do that, and then the gardeners working with me have to do that, and it's just not fun. But it can be kind of lovely. Or if you really want to do like a commercial style installation, you might dig out some, lay down road base, compact that, and then do a light layer of this pea gravel on top of it. Or if you want to go even smaller than pea gravel, there's something called bird's eye gravel, which this might actually be. That's even a little smaller. That's quite lovely. And then I love this stone edging on it as well. Or working with a mulch pathway. Normally, and what you'll see in our example is that in my yards, I normally just have mulch pathways in between the plants, or combination. Like this is mulch with pavers that you can just buy from the hardware store. Looks quite nice, quite easy to install. If you want to, you can use a level to make sure each one of these is level. So I had a question come in: would the pea gravel installation be the same process as the DG install? Similar, except that you don't need to compact the pea gravel. You just kind of give it a nice raking with that bow rake at the end, and then you're good to go. And here's a nice combination of decomposed granite and then leading to flagstone set with just decomposed granite in between, so not in mortar. So then any water falling on it from the rain can infiltrate as well. And then one last note before we move on: if you are laying out paths and you want them to be kind of naturalistic, going through a decent sized garden, and you want kind of a nice curve, a couple of ways to do that. One is you can leave a garden hose in the sun for a while to get it nice and flexible. And then you can lay it out in your landscape and kind of keep adjusting it here and there till you get it how you like it. And then along it, put some stakes. If you're going to be doing your work pretty quickly after that, you can trace it with the flour. If you're in the rainy season, don't trace it with the flour and not put any stakes in, because if it rains, you can lose all of your work. But one of the things I really like to do, if you have the materials around, or definitely if you're doing a large yard, it might be worth the investment of getting the materials, is you can hook up lengths of PVC pipe, and that, even more than a hose, will tend to give you really nice kind of long curving lengths, and then you can trace it from there. If you know where you want your main curves to be as well, you can see here, we ended up adjusting it some, but you can hit in a couple of wood stakes and main points you want to hit with one of the edges of your path, and then you can lay it out, and it gives you a nice curve. In general, for most homeowners, if you're going to be doing irrigation work, you might just use 3/4 inch PVC pipe, because that's what you're going to be using for your irrigation work. But if you're really doing a large site or commercially, that 1 inch PVC, it's a little bit thicker. It's not something that's going to be useful in most homes for actual plumbing work, but that makes a really nice, gentle curve. And then you can do this either as the center line of your path and then measure out for many feet in each direction, or you can do it as one of the edges and then just measure in one direction. Either way will work just fine. So let's take a look at some questions before we move on to our next section. So a question about the broken concrete patio. No need to frame the broken concrete patio with a wood strip or with edging. No, I normally don't. The broken concrete is, as long as you're working with good large pieces of broken concrete at the edge, that stuff is really not going to want to go anywhere. If you have really small pieces of broken concrete at the edge, then you might want to do that to make sure that none of them kind of shift and nobody rolls an ankle. From Whitney, can you skip the weed cloth? If you do not have issues with weeds, you can skip the weed cloth. It's kind of just a assurance. As well, with the decomposed granite, sometimes it's thought that that helps keep the decomposed granite from mixing down with the soil, but I honestly don't think that's really that much of an issue. From Charlie, I sheet mulched the entire garden a couple of weeks ago to kill the lawn and weeds. Awesome. Was hoping to plant in 8 weeks' time. If I wanted to add a small decomposed granite area on one side of the lawn just before planting, would it be too late to do that? No, it wouldn't be too late to do that. What you're going to want to do is in that area, you're just going to need to pull out all of the sheet mulch. And then if there's any of the like thatch organic matter left from the lawn, you're going to want to dig that out as well. After another 8 weeks, it's going to be a lot easier to dig out than if you're digging out the lawn. And in fact, that area that I just showed where we did that broken concrete patio, that had been a lawn when we moved in. We had sheet mulched it. It was one of the first things we did. And that's exactly what I did. Just had to remove all that concrete and then scrape up a little bit of that organic matter, which was really not that much by the time I got to it. So that would be just fine. You definitely would want to probably though, especially if you had Bermuda grass, put in that weed cloth underneath your decomposed granite, because after 8 weeks of sheet mulching, kind of in the fall, I still would expect some potential Bermuda grass regrowth when it comes back. And it's pretty easy to just dig out of like garden soil, but it's really kind of a pain once it starts coming up in your decomposed granite patio. You have to dig into it, you have to re-level, recompact, all that sort of stuff. Okay, so now we're going to look at that other aspect of grading, which is if you need to move soil around to do something like dig a dry stream bed. If you are interested in really getting into design and construction of infiltration features like dry stream beds and berms and infiltration basins, in January, we're going to be doing a rainwater harvesting for home gardens class, and that's going to really get into that design and layout. And we'll probably show some of these same slides in terms of the construction part of it, but we'll be able to get way deep into that and answer questions about kind of the application and the design of those features. This is going to mostly just have to focus on the construction itself, which for residential situation can be quite simple. So this is the aerial photograph of the property when we moved in. Slight slope from north to south. And there's no rain gutters on the house. The eaves are kind of a weird rounded shape at the end, and it'd be a lot of kind of surgery to put in rain gutters. And so when we moved in, what happened is when it rains, we got flooding all in this area from water coming down this way, water coming down this way. A lot of water would come down and then flood in this area. Fortunately, there's enough of a grade break in the paving that the garage didn't flood, but this whole area would flood down through here. And then the planter here between the house and the patio, just a narrow planter, all of this would flood. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to create a system where we can harvest that water from here, from here, from here, from here, and gracefully bring it into the yard, put it through a series of infiltration features and get it away from the house and the foundation, kind of bring it through the garden, something that would be nice to look at, and then eventually have a sunken meadow area, which would be a nice grassy small meadow during most of the year, but then could actually just flood as the final place where water could accumulate in a large rain event. And so you can see here's a not completely updated, but updated enough aerial photo where you can kind of see the gesture of where that came through. You can't really see the plants having greened up at all. A lot of the plants are in here, but here's just the basic outline of the dry stream bed coming through here. And here's that meadow area. And so to do that, we needed to do a few things. We needed to dig out soil through here. And then what we were going to do when we created this sunken meadow, here's that broken concrete patio that I just showed you. You can see we used some of the other broken concrete to create stepping stones to go to different areas of the garden. And then we wanted to create kind of a level garden terrace right here to both have more of a feeling of a grade separation, kind of aesthetically for the garden, have the space feel less flat or more, even though there's a bit of a slope, really feel like it's two separate spaces. And we wanted to increase the capacity of our final sunken infiltration basin. And then we also felt like it would be nice if the meadow felt a little sunken down here. So dug up soil through here and piled it up on this side to create a flat raised area and then a sunken meadow area. And so we'll look at all of that right now. And so I'm not going to really show pictures of the front yard. We look at the front yard in a lot of the other workshops that we do, but this whole system had to start in the front. And in the front, we didn't have a lot of room to do a dry stream bed. And the water came down over here, kind of flooded the sidewalk, really wanted to collect the water and get it out as quickly as possible. So we implemented something called a French drain, which is essentially a trench, a little more than a foot wide here, about a foot deep, which was as deep as we can get because there was an irrigation line that we're still going to use that ran all through here. And then this would get filled with a coarse gravel and allow some water to infiltrate, but just kind of move the water through in between the air spaces in between the gravel. So this was along the front. The walkway sloped a little bit down in this direction. And so the trench was able to just follow the walkway. So in the bottom of here, in the bottom of the trench, when there was water in it, it would just lightly flow this way. And then we had to have it bank and make a left turn. So in most cases, as long as your concrete path is in decent conditions, you can kind of dig underneath it and the concrete will be just fine, as long as it's a relatively small area. And so getting through is quite a bit of work, but it is doable. Combination of reaching in with a shovel, digging out with a hand trowel underneath there, and then for the final bit in between, combination of working with a hand trowel and then also like a 3/4 inch or 1 inch length of galvanized steel pipe being smacked by a metal 4-pound sledgehammer can help just get that last bit of soil out from underneath. And then if water is flowing through and it's just open, potentially over time, you can get some erosion underneath. And so what I like to do is get a large diameter piece of pipe, and you don't need much of it, but just have it stick out a little bit on each end. And then you can pack in gravel all around it. And that just allows water to go through without having to interact much with the soil around it in that kind of critical area underneath the pathway. And so you can see here then along the edge of this whole asphalt area, we continued to dig that French drain because this whole area would flood as well. And so this allowed us to collect the water that would flood this whole area right off the edge and get it into the system. And we don't really want to be focusing our infiltration on the near the foundations, but sometimes it's just a very practical way. Some of it will infiltrate, but if there's a lot of water, it's mostly going to keep moving. And here we already had that slope that was causing that flooding problem. And so in the bottom, we're about a foot deep, but it still all slopes, follows the grade, and we'll continue to go through here. And I'll show the full connection a little bit later, but just wanted to then jump to laying out the larger areas. And what I will generally do if it's my own garden, if it's a professional job, we will have it drawn out on plans. We'll have reference locations. We'll kind of survey it in off of a hard location like the edge of the house. If it's my backyard, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out. I might have sketched it out on a piece of paper, but mostly I'm going to stand there, kind of picture what I think is going to work. And then I'll use, in the case like this, just the corner of my flat point shovel and just kind of start carving things out roughly. And if it looks good, I'll keep it. And generally what I'll do is I'll kind of resmudge it and kind of pull things apart and just kind of keep working and feel it out. And then like in this case, this is pretty narrow. So I was kind of trying to figure out like, what can I make work? Here's the edge of the patio, and we knew this was going to come through, and here's what the patio is going to be. But realistically, in a backyard situation, as long as it's my own yard, I like to kind of feel this out in person rather than draw it out on a plan sometimes, because you can really know sometimes when you're drawing it out, it's a bit abstract. And so eventually this was going to get wider, but just kind of figuring it out as you go. And especially for somebody who's not doing this day in, day out, it's going to be a lot less intimidating to at least figure out some of that sort of stuff in the field. If you draw it out on paper, you're going to get to a point where you're going to be putting it out in the field, and chances are you're going to have to adjust some things, and that might change your planting plan a little bit. That's fine. Just because it's on paper, don't consider it set, or you're going to be missing opportunities that you're going to notice. And so you can see here, coming up through here, we were really limited on our space. And so it's kind of a mixture between that French drain approach and then slowly widening as we have more space to be that more open dry stream bed was the plan. So you can see the chalk lines kind of running through here, figuring that out. Then when it comes to digging, some digging techniques, very important, round point or spade shovel for doing this work. And generally in most soil types, what I would recommend is have your lines marked out. You can see the end of a chalk line right here for the edges of this thing. And you're going to want to kind of notch out soil a bit from one edge to start with. Then you might jump to the other edge and then go back and forth. It is always easier when you're digging soil rather than starting in an area where it's just all soil, to be working from an edge where it's already been loosened up, whether it's going this way or over time maybe working back that way, to be digging from an area that's all soil kind of into an open area as you lift the shovel out. And so you can see as it goes, kind of slowly widening, hitting the roots of some of the old trees. And as we went, for example, there was an old stump of what used to be a huge palm tree that was long gone by the time we got there. But we had the arborist, when we were there, grind out as much of that stump as we can. But just this whole area was a very fibrous knot of roots. And so I did plan originally for our swale to go right through here, or dry stream bed. And we just had to modify it over time. It had to be less wide here and kind of bank left, because I'd spent hours and hours and hours digging out roots and just wasn't making good progress. So staying a little bit flexible. And then over time, this just became kind of a shallow bank of that dry stream bed with rocks over it. We couldn't plant in there, but just sometimes that happens. And so you can see here where it had to be narrow. You can see I had worked this side on the left already, and then coming back and working the side on the right, and then eventually expanding that a little bit more, kind of going as we went. You can see here, this is the area where I said to let the water through. We had to break it out and then carefully chose our 3 of our nicest large pieces of concrete. 2-person job, working with a dolly because it was very heavy, kind of get these over here. They were a beast to level, and just my own backyard project. I didn't get them perfect, but it was good enough. So that's just kind of being very open with the realities of doing DIY projects. I wasn't going to rent or try to bring in a large piece of equipment to get them set perfectly, or hire, 4 other people. My partner Kyra and I just did it ourselves and got it as perfectly as we can, which was perfectly good. So continuing to work, keeping in mind where you're putting your soil that you're digging out as well. Put it somewhere where it's not going to be in the way for you an hour later, or even 3 days later, or dig it directly into a wheelbarrow in some cases, if you're going to have to be piling it up somewhere else. And so you can see here, even before we had a chance to get the rock work in, basically what I mentioned, DIY projects, sometimes you're just doing it on the schedule that you need to. And so for me, the schedule was, it's not going to be a completed garden by the rainy season, but we don't want to go through another rainy season of flooding. So I want to at least rough this stuff in here, make sure that we aren't going to be getting erosion through this soil, but at least get the rough design and the rough trenching in, so that the flooding is no longer going to be an issue. And you can see it's already working. You can see all this water coming through here, and that is not, this whole area is not flooded. And then what we were able to do, because the rainy season had been there, and you can see here, this is the French drain, which wasn't there in the last picture in the first storm, improving that functionality even more. We can go through a few storm events, and we were able to tweak things and expand things as necessary to really have it be kind of perfect. Again, same thing. A professional job wouldn't have the luxury of doing it, but it's kind of really nice to be working in your own backyard. So here, you can see even at the time that we planted, so ideally, this whole thing would be in, rock work done, this would have been expanded, this would be perfect by the time we planted. But we were dealing with wanting to plant in the right season and limited amount of time on the weekends. So it's kind of a jumble, but it worked out. And that's just kind of the reality if you're doing a big DIY project like this. And so you can see here, again, no rock work yet, but you can see what's happening as the dry stream bed is getting wider. And here we were going to create a bridge over this area using 2 of our large pieces of broken concrete. And then underneath it, kind of as a footing for the bridge pieces, there's additional stacks of broken concrete, which creates 2 separate kind of infiltration zones. So to distribute that water throughout the garden and allow it to soak in different places and not all accumulate at the base. In having this here, it also creates a little bit of a dam where there's just one area where the water gets through. So this area on the right fills up before it would spill over and then go through here and then flood this lower area. And so you can see here, edge here. And so this is as far as we got by that rainy season, and that's just fine. You can see as we were digging this down, not completed yet, but starting to kind of cut this edge and build up this soil over here some. And then you could see, same thing as we're doing this work, we're putting rocks aside, putting the smaller rocks in buckets. We're going to use all of this stuff in the landscape later. Just kind of keeping it out of the way. And so here you could see, not much to look at yet, but the function starting to work quite well. Then starting to fill with gravel. In the French drain areas, you are going to completely fill, if you're doing something like this, them with the gravel. And the main gravel that you want to use for a French drain is a kind of large size gravel. And I prefer the aesthetics of just a normal washed river rock. So you don't want to use a crushed gravel. That's stuff that's used to structurally interlock. And so locally, normally it's 1.5 inches to like 2-inch gravel. The place that I get it from calls it drain rock, but then, I always make sure they're going to be sending, it's just washed, graded river rock. It's not crushed. And then starting over time to mix in slowly as we have time and rock that's coming up from the backyard, other sizes. So it looks a little bit more natural. So you're filling in, going around the side. This is it kind of freshly delivered. And so you'll see more as things go, you'll see how that develops a little bit more. But we had gotten to the point in the season where we were wanting to do planting. And so we're now looking at acquiring plants. For an adequate selection of California native or Waterwise plants, even though general nurseries are starting to be a little bit better, you're going to want to go to specialty nurseries. So you can see if you're local to our area, kind of Western San Bernardino County, Inland Empire, even like San Gabriel Valley, you can see our landscape material suppliers list. We have some LA nurseries that are on my radar as well that have, especially the California native plants. Even places like Armstrong are getting a lot better with the general Waterwise plants. And then lots of neighborhoods have nurseries here and there. So it's not everything, but you're going to want to go to a specialized place. You're not going to be able to expect to find all the plants you're looking for Waterwise garden if you just hit Home Depot. You might not always be able to find every plant you're looking for, even at the specialty nurseries. So you might have to revise your design as necessary, stay a little bit flexible. You're always going to want to select relatively small for the pot size, healthy, vigorous looking plants. It is definitely not the biggest plant is the best value. And we'll look at some examples later on. Unless you have a specific reason to purchase plants in a larger or smaller size, 1 gallon plants are generally the way to go. They're going to give you the best value and also in terms of survivability, how quickly they transition to the landscape and how quickly they get growing. 1 gallon plants are almost always what I'll plant unless I just can't find that plant in a 1 gallon plant. If you're doing a bunch of small grasses or a little meadow, you can go smaller if you can find them. And then sometimes trees will only be available in 5 or occasionally a 15 gallon. But normal shrubs and perennials, 1 gallon. I will never plant a 5 gallon shrub. The 1 gallon turns into a 5 gallon size just so quickly. It's so much faster to plant, and it's usually faster growing in the long run and a lot cheaper. And then, if you can, plan to purchase your plants immediately before planting, ideally. If you are not going to be doing that, realize that you're going to need to care for those plants until you plant them, which, since you're going to need to be checking on them pretty much every day, that might set you back a little bit in terms of your time to prepare your site. Even Waterwise plants should be checked daily when they're at home. Succulents, you don't need to worry about as much, but anything else, because things can dry out pretty quickly in those 1 gallon pots. This time of year, when it's still hot, if it's in full sun, every day. If it's really, really hot, you might need to water 1 gallon plants in full sun twice a day. Ideally, when I get them home, I'll put them in a place that's at least afternoon shade. But if there are plants that want to be in full sun, you can't leave them in the shade for week after week. They're going to start getting kind of leggy and not that healthy. So to keep things simple, you want to bring them in kind of right before you're able to plant, if that's possible. If you are finding yourselves needing to water them over time, one thing that's going to make your life a lot easier is get used to the weight of a pot after it has been thoroughly and deeply watered. And that way you can just kind of quickly walk through and pick up a few pots really quickly, and you'll know if they need to be watered. When you're figuring that out, water your plant a lot. Pull it out of the pot and ensure that you're looking at a plant that's been watered all the way through, and then you can kind of start to get a feel of that weight. So these were some of the plants we brought in. So for some of our meadow areas, this is some yarrow, a great native plant that was available in 4-inch by the flat. So we did that. And then here's most of our other 1 gallon plants. This one is one that we had bought in the past as a 1 gallon, didn't plant it in our last garden. And so we had potted it up to a 5 gallon, was just waiting to grow out. And then we will continue to, see, it's 10:45. Why don't we take our quick break right now? And then we are going to cover planting, and we'll get way into planting because that's going to be one of the most important things for you to take from the workshop today. So it is 10:46 now. Let's just take a quick 5-minute break. So we will start back up just a little bit after 10:51 and keep going from there. If you have any questions about what we've been talking about, send them in during our break, and we can start with some Q&A before we get into planting. And we'll be getting started again in just about a minute or so. Okay, back refreshed with coffee, having explained to the cat that he can't come into this room with me and stomp all over the computer keyboard. So I think we're ready to go. So now we're talking about planting day. Planting day or planting days are so critical to setting yourself up for long-term success. So the process is going to be doing a final field layout of actually putting the plants in their pots out where they are going to be planted. This is something to do with laying out in their locations all of the plants you think you'll plant that day all at once so you can look at them together before you start sticking things into the ground. Take all the time you need to look it over. Remember, as we talked about in our other classes, that one of the main places where people often go wrong for beginning gardeners, sometimes even advanced gardeners, because we just end up loving plants and wanting to put in too many, is putting too many plants too close together. So it is not, especially if you're a beginning gardener, it's something that I still do, at least roughly, is as you lay things out, measure the spaces in between the plants. If you know that this plant is going to be 6 feet wide, make sure it has 3 feet in every direction. Review your plants, especially the ones that are near pathways or driveways. If you need to look up again or look up online how wide something's going to be to make sure it's going to be far enough off the pathway or the driveway, do that. You don't want to take a shortcut, just put it in the ground, and then a year later it's getting overgrown and you have to cut it back all the time. So to me, the time, whether it's a few minutes, whether it's an hour on a large site, between putting the plants out in the pot and then walking through everything, nudging things here and there, for the larger trees, looking at it from multiple angles, making sure everything's going to work out, getting out the measuring tape, kind of measuring things. That is sacred time for me. That is so important because once you put things in the ground, they are there and they're going to start growing. And sometimes as you do that, you might start getting new ideas. Oh, if I shift this over here, it's going to block the view of that other thing that I don't want to see in the background. That's just something that you would have never thought of or figured out just from working out the design on paper. You can change things at that point in time. I always, even on professional projects, even some of the best planting designers in the world who I really admire, they're often there on site on that layout day, kind of doing some last minute shifting things around. So feel free to do that. And then when it comes to planting, digging the hole, setting up a watering ring, which we'll look at, so important. Don't put a $12 plant in a $2 hole. Do due diligence to the whole planting process. That is what is going to transition your plant into the real world. In some way, we always really want to start with good planting material. But in some ways, even the best planting material, what you're purchasing is potential. A nursery pot and potting soil is a very artificial situation for a Waterwise plant or a native plant. And so what we do with our planting hole, with our initial watering in, those are absolutely just so essential to getting plants off to the right start to where they can realize their potential and actually become healthy Waterwise plants. When we do your watering in is that first watering after you plant. It's going to be the most important watering your plant ever gets. It not only provides water, but it also settles the soil around the plant. It if it's done well, collapses any loose spots or air bubbles or anything like that. And then there's going to be some cleanup and touch up. We're not going to talk about plant selection Today, we do that a lot in a lot of our other classes, but remember, you're going to be setting yourself up for success by always focus on doing your research and selecting the right plant for the right place. And one of the most important parts of that is if you have poorly draining heavy clay soil, don't try to change that. You're going to choose plants adapted to clay soils. And that's going to make you successful, or really help go a long way to making you successful with your plantings. You want to do a drainage test if you have not already. And to me, doing a drainage test is part of the design, because then you need to know that to know what plants you're going to be planting. Guides for doing that and what that means at cbwcd.org/native landscape guide. That will get you our California Native Landscape Design Guide, which has an area that talks about soil drainage tests and what that means. And then definitely check out our other design-based classes, as well as the Inland Valley Garden Planner. If you have not seen it already, we do demos in a lot of the classes. That's at inlandvalleygardenplanner.org. And that is our website and resource for Southern California about choosing and learning about the best plants for our area. So this is plant layout, January 2019. So this 1 gallon little pot here, this is our tree that we're going to be putting into the landscape. It's a small tree. We're very careful with how we're pruning it around the power line, but this was just the only place for this tree to go. So again, not the best situation, but working with it. One thing I always like to do with trees is to really help picture how they're going to grow in the landscape. I look at it with my mind's eye, but if there's 2 people out here, this is my partner behind the camera looking at me, acting like a tree, looking at it from different angles, seeing how that tree is going to grow in over time and picturing how it will interact with the landscape around it. And then we switch positions and she stands there and I look at it from every different angle. Really, really want to get your tree in the right place. So important. And this is a native desert willow, which naturally is a plant that grows on the edge of riparian areas that seasonally flood. So it's perfect to go along our swale. It'll like that extra seasonal winter water, and its root system is adapted to that. Wouldn't plant like an oak tree that close to that area. And so here is wide angle. So you see, we did, as I mentioned, get to the point where to plant in the right season, which, we're early January, wanted to plant not much later than that. We couldn't finish all of our other work here. So here it is, plant layout day. Some plants near the patio tend to work with smaller plants closer together, and then wider shrubs farther out. You can see here, everything 1 gallon plants, no need for anything bigger. I was really happy to find that desert willow in a 1 gallon plant. Oftentimes that's one that you need to buy in a 5 gallon plant. You can see here towards the bottom of the yard, looking up, is a rather large backyard. The backyard space is why we bought this house. So you can see here, continuing to work on different things. Proper planting. Super important. What you generally do not need for native gardens, if you're working to plants native to that area, also chosen for your soil type, which means if you have heavy clay soil, planting plants adapted to heavy clay soil, and you can search for that on our Inland Valley Garden Planner website as a search criteria, and it will give you plenty to work from if that's what you have for good choices. In general, native and Waterwise plants are going to want no soil amendments, no fertilizers, none of that vitamin B12 stuff that they sell for transplant. These are plants that are adapted to growing where we live. They're adapted to lean soils without a lot of fertility. If they needed a bunch of fertilizer, then they wouldn't be growing natively in our area. So you could just skip all of that stuff. In general, if you have well-drained soil, no compost back in that hole, no planting mix. That doesn't encourage the plant to have its roots spread out wide, looking for moisture, looking for nutrients, following the pattern of of the Waterwise plants. You just don't need that stuff. The only case in which I would do anything different, there are two cases with the backfill, is if you have very heavy clay soil, you might mix up to 1/3 compost or planting mix into the backfill, not for an amendment for the plant. The only reason why you would do that is because the potting soil in your nursery plant is very different than your heavy clay soil. And so to create a transition zone, mixing in a third planting mix or a third compost back into that hole can make a more gradual transition from the root system of the planting pot to the native soil around it. If you have sandy or silty or general well-drained soil, even sand with a good amount of gravel, you don't need to do anything else other than use your native soil as the backfill. However, I have had literally one time when I was planting on a site where it was so much gravel, we were almost planting in pure rock in some areas. And we were planting with native plants. I was really happy we chose native plants for that project. We were planting with native plants that grow in very gravelly areas naturally. So I knew that they were going to be just fine after they got their roots out. However, there was so much gravel that if we put the pot into the planting hole and backfilled, there would be like almost no soil contact between anything that was like soil, or much of anything that was like soil, and the plant pot itself, which was again that organic material. So there we did bring in, just from a landscape materials yard, some topsoil to mix in with that gravel. We mixed like a third topsoil with a third of that very gravelly stuff, just again as that transition zone. But if you have just average soil, you don't need any of this stuff. And the plants are going to grow just fine. If you over fertilize, things will actually grow too fast. You'll have weak wood. It's not going to be good long term. So, quick planting demonstration. This is something where normally when we teach this workshop in person, we all go outside and look at this together. So I've done my best to include detailed pictures, and hopefully this will do the job for you. Question that just came in, the plants that come with artificial soil with vermiculite or perlite, should you wash those away? No, you don't need to do any of that. Just plant it how it is, and the roots will transition out and it will be just fine from there. The only thing that we will do to take into account for that is the planting height. We'll plant it a little bit high, and we'll look at that in just a second. So here's an example. This is a California native penstemon, a little flowering perennial. And we're going to be planting it into an area that had previously been cardboard mulched or sheet mulched to smother the weeds underneath a little while back, and then with our wood chip mulch. And so, important thing, if you have wood chip mulch, you never want your wood chip mulch to get into your planting hole. If you get too much of that coarse woody material into your planting hole, eventually it will break down over time, but the soil microbes will go to work breaking it down. And in that process, they'll actually lock up the nitrogen available to the soil for your plant growth. So you always want to make sure you get all that mulch off to the side. And then you can see our kind of rotting down cardboard right here. I'll show a close-up of this tool later on. If you're going to be cutting into old cardboard, as well as just for weeding overall and many other garden tasks, this is a tool called a hori hori. It's a Japanese kind of a garden knife, where one side, it's not as sharp as a normal knife, but it's somewhat sharp. One side is smooth, one side is toothed, and it's just such a useful tool. So the tooth side, serrated side, is really great for just cutting away as much of this wet cardboard as you need. And you can see here a little bit of that old weedy rotting material down there. Just kind of grab that out of the way with your hand, toss it aside. And then digging the hole. When I'm digging holes into a mulched landscape, I always will dig it into some sort of bucket, because if you pile up your soil onto your mulch, then when it's come to backfill, you're going to end up with mulch in your backfill and soil on your mulch, and neither of those situations is ideal. You can use anything that you have around. If you have an old storage bin, you can use it. But if you are going to be doing any significant amount of gardening, I absolutely love these flexible rubber tubs. With these kind of rubber tubs, you do get what you pay for. So these things might be around like 20 bucks or so. You can order them online. Company used to be called Tub Trugs. I think it's called Red now. And they're just very flexible, really durable, kind of rubberized plastic. And they're just great for dumping soil in, and then they're flexible. So you can kind of pour soil back out if you ever need to mix soil or soak things. Really super useful. They're also my main thing. I'll put my weeds into them, and then I'll dump that into the green bin. So digging out the hole. And remember, for these shovels, these little areas folded down on the top of the shovel, that's for your boot. These are meant to be kicked into the soil. That's how a shovel works. So if you're digging a bunch of holes and you're trying to do it all with your arm strength, that's going to take forever. That being said, if you have a pair of boots, wear your boots on planting day. If not, wear a good set of tennis shoes or athletic shoes that you don't mind getting kind of trashed. Don't be doing this in flip-flops. It's going to make so much more work for you. And so, see, digging out the hole, once you get kind of your rough hole size, you are going to just kind of lightly smooth out the bottom. You might have another handful of soil or two to get out. And what you're aiming for with the hole is for the hole to be slightly less deep than your root ball and about twice as wide or a little bit less. So that doesn't twice as wide as the total diameter. So just a little bit more again on like the radius of this. So something like this. You don't need to dig a giant, huge hole, but you just want enough that you can pack that soil back in and make sure that there's no big gaps. And you want it to be a little bit proud. This is maybe a little bit exaggerated, but I wanted to leave it exaggerated for the picture. You want your root ball, so not the top rim of the pot, but the actual soil level to be 1 to 2 inches above the surrounding soil level. And again, make sure that the mulch is out of the way enough that you know where the actual soil level is. We're not talking about the mulch layer, we're talking about the real soil level. And the reason why, it's a couple of things. Most Waterwise and native plants want good drainage. So if you're doing this with like an ornamental grass or something like that, that doesn't care as much, it's a good general rule, but it doesn't matter as much. But for most native and Waterwise plants, they want good drainage. And where they are most susceptible to problems of rot, if there's too much water for too long, is at the root crown, right where the stems or the trunk meets the base of the soil. And so number one thing we want to do with the proper planting is ensure that that root crown area is never going to be lower than all of the surrounding soil, where water will just kind of sit there every time it rains, and that area will stay moist for long extended periods of time. And so by planting it just a little bit high, water will stay in the root zone as soon as these roots go out, but it won't settle right at the root crown. And then because, like we mentioned, that the soil in the nursery pots, that's a very organic mix, it's not real soil, that over time is going to kind of biodegrade some and break down some more. And so sometimes it can happen with a 1 gallon plant, but especially the larger 5 gallon, 15 gallon, or box trees, which you never really would have a reason to put in a residential landscape, in my opinion. Any of those can lose some volume of that initial potting soil over time. And with that, you can lose some height. And so if you start a little bit tall and you lose some of that volume, you'll maybe end even, but you'll never end with the root crown kind of down in a hole, which is critical. And so from there, you're going to, once you ensure, so sometimes it's a process of looking and I need to dig a little bit more or pack a little bit soil back in. It's worth it to get it right. This is one of the most critical things you can do to ensure success for your plants. Absolutely crucial, and one of the most common things that I see that go wrong. So take your time on it. The more often you do it, the quicker that process will go. And then you're going to tease your plant out of the pot. For 1 gallon plants, often what I will do, sometimes you'll need to kind of squeeze the sides of the pot to loosen things up a little bit, just gently. And then you can see how I've threaded my fingers over the top of the soil with the main stems of the plants coming out kind of between my fingers. Kind of, you can see it turning it upside down, squeezing it a little bit, gently pulling it out. And you can see here, this is a pretty good looking root system where there's enough roots to hold it together. They're just starting to circle at the edge, but they're not really overgrown. We'll look a little bit later at some overgrown pictures. And so from here, a couple of things that I always like to do. I always will make sure, even though the plants won't be dry because I've been watering, I've been checking, but I want to make sure that the plants the root system is completely saturated before I plant it. So what I'll do is before I don't loosen any roots or anything like that, I will submerge it gently in a bucket of water. Now, if you pull your plant out of the pot and the roots haven't reached the edge or have barely reached the edge, skip this step, because if the roots aren't grown in enough and you put it down in a bucket of water, some of that soil might float away. But in general, what I'll do, I'll then submerge that plant, still holding on to it, make sure I don't lose soil, and then bubbles will come out. It's kind of water is going in, air is leaving. And once those bubbles slow down some, which is just kind of a few moments usually, lift it out. You'll see the water dripping out. Give it a couple of moments to just drain the first part of that water, still holding on to it. And then gently loosen the roots. If there's just a few roots, this can be done by hand. And this is for most plants. Most plants, it's better to loosen the roots and then make sure that they all continue to grow outwards rather than the curved roots will just kind of keep circling around and eventually constrict and maybe even strangle the plant if you don't kind of reset the roots from a nursery pot. That's just normal. Within California native plants, there's a few exceptions. I will never do that. You never want to do that with manzanitas. They're super sensitive to root disturbance. Just make sure you don't buy overgrown plants. Barely even look at the roots, just put them in the ground. I also don't do it with ceanothus either, but almost everything else I will do that with. If you happen to be planting avocados, same thing. Don't plant with avocados, or don't do that with avocados either. But most of the time we'll tease out the roots. If there are a lot of roots, the serrated side of that hori-hori knife, you can kind of just shave the whole root ball. And that's normally what I'll do with trees as well, because getting the roots to grow perfectly outwards is so critical for trees. With this one, you can kind of just loosen, make sure you do the bottom too. So you can see there. And as you do that, you want to do it gently so you don't lose too much of the soil. And then last thing for good measure, on sandier soils, it doesn't matter as much, but on clay soils, just the action of the shovel digging the hole can kind of align the clay particles and almost make it like a little ceramic pot. And so whether it's with a shovel or the hori-hori, it's called scarifying, or just kind of roughing up the surrounding edge of the hole. If there is any of that blockage created by the alignment of those clay particles, just roughing up the edge of the hole provides avenues for those roots to find their way out. And then you're going to place that down. And before you backfill, give it one last look and make sure that your root ball is still at the right height. Occasionally with that loosening, you'll lose, half an inch of soil off the bottom of the root ball. And so you might need to put a little bit of soil back in. In this case, you can see we're still looking pretty good. And then another reason why I like those flexible tubs is it makes the backfill really quick and really easy. You can kind of just bend and shake that tub and kind of shake that soil in all the way around. On a 1 gallon hole, I'll kind of get it halfway, and then not super hard, but gentle, firm pressure with my hands. I'll kind of compact that soil just a little bit, just making sure that there's no big air gaps. Continue with the rest of it. And then you can see what I'm doing here is I'm starting this kind of ridge that's building. I'm starting to set up what's called a watering ring. So with that back soil, I'm keeping the root crown just a little bit high. Then there's just a slight slope. And then sometimes you need to bring in some soil from elsewhere in the garden to create a little donut around this. So I can give it a first good watering in with my watering wand. If you're going to be doing much hand watering, especially if you don't have an automatic irrigation system, investing in a really good watering wand is critical because this is your irrigation system. We'll talk later on a little bit more about that, because you really want to make sure you can kind of flood this area around it, not just the existing root ball, but where those roots are going to next grow out into. You want to make sure that you can accumulate at least one, ideally a couple of inches of water within this mound, and then let it soak through. And the first time I plant something, I always will fill that hole 3 times, triple water, because you really want to make sure you're getting a good deep watering. If the soil around the root ball is really dry, if it has not been watered in a long time because it's a new area, very dry soil can literally wick the water out of your root ball and dry out your plant very quickly, as that dry soil literally has an ability through capillary action to suck that higher moisture out as it kind of evens things out. And we see it happen. So a couple of things. If at all possible, it will also make your digging a lot easier. You want to have not wet, but a nice kind of even medium soil moisture when you're planting. It's easier on the plant because you don't have that drying out action. It makes it easier to dig. So if the area hasn't had an irrigation system for a long time, I will get just one of those cheap like oscillating fan sprinklers from the hardware store, run it the week before I'm planting for a long time. Sometimes if it's really dry soil, it might not want to absorb the water at first. So I'll run it for a while till it kind of seems like it can't absorb anymore. Let that soak in. When the top has soaked in, I'll go out with a shovel and I'll dig. Sometimes the first time it's only a couple of inches have gotten penetrated. So you might need to do it again, and again, till at least a foot deep. It's been nicely soaked, but then you need to let it dry out. Sandy soil, 2 to 3 days. Clay soil might be 5 days or so, to where things are not super wet. They're just kind of evenly moist. That's ideal. If you aren't or can't do that, dig your holes first, and then you can, in addition to soaking your root ball, you can fill your holes with water a couple of times and let them drain out. That might mean, especially if your soil is really dry, sometimes it's literally hydrophobic. It takes a long time for the water to start to soak in. Now that's a really important process, so that then the soil can accept water after you plant, if your soil is that dry. So you might need to do something like digging your holes the day before, doing that couple of fills with water, and actually finishing the planting the next day. It's all going to be kind of site specific. So take your time, come up with your plan, kind of poke around, see soil moisture, kind of know what to anticipate. Couple of questions just came in before we move on. So question about what's called mycorrhizal fungi added to soils when planting. Nearly all California native books that Charlie has read mentions these. So for those of you who have not heard of this, really important for the life of our plants, kind of like there's been all this stuff written in the last few years about like our personal gut microbiome and all the beneficial bacteria that keep us alive and let us digest food. Plants get a lot of their water and their nutrients in the soil through beneficial interactions with fungi and bacteria in the soil. And the fungi that lives, and some of them literally grow into the root tips of the plants. And they have this kind of agreement where the plant photosynthesizes and provides sugar to the fungus. The fungus supplies certain nutrients and moisture by extending the root of the plant, essentially. And 90% of terrestrial plants have these interactions. Very important for native plants as well as most plants. Here's my stance on mycorrhizal fungi. I've looked into it a lot. I've talked with a lot of people. I've talked with laboratories who produce the stuff. In the average yard, if it has not gone through trauma, if you have decent soil, you probably don't need to worry about it. Those species are going to be around. If, for example, I've had commercial projects where it used to be a parking lot, now we're planting a native garden. If usually like situations like that where the soil's really been through some trauma, if somebody had been parking a truck for 30 years in the area where now you're going to put in a garden. Those are the kinds of situations where adding the mycorrhizal fungi might be helpful. In most cases, like my house, that just abandoned soil in the areas where we converted turf that are now native gardens, I'm confident that those species are there because we put the native plants in and they grow super, super well, even that kind of just dried out looking soil. So really, if it's only kind of trauma that it's been to, if you are going to add mycorrhizal fungi, there's a couple of ways to do it. If you're really into it, you can track down the labs doing the specific stuff. And in large commercial projects where we're planting tens of thousands of plants, I've ordered that. But some of the higher end fertilizers brands have those mycorrhizal fungi. They'll buy them from the same labs available. And so, for example, like Dr. Earth is a brand. I think maybe EB Stone does it as well. They'll have a blend where it's pretty light on the actual nutrients. And sometimes they're called like a jump starter blend or something like that. Pretty light on the nutrients, but they have those mycorrhizal fungi. It's not bad. It can't really hurt. It just might not be necessary. But one thing you want to absolutely ensure, there's a lot of products on the market that are basically snake oil. The companies buy really low quality stuff. They don't store them right. So if you're going to be getting something for the benefits of that mycorrhizal fungi, whether it's for your vegetable garden or for Waterwise plants, check the label. If they don't tell you how many organisms are in the package, what the name of the species are, all of that kind of detailed scientific sounding information, and they just say like, beneficial mycorrhizal fungi and don't give you the details, how many organisms per package, all that. Don't go with that stuff. All the reputable brands will have that detailed information. And then also storage is kind of important. You don't want to buy it if it's like on display in the nursery, like in full baking sun, which is sometimes the case. Get it from a nursery or a supplier where it's in the shade or indoors. So next question. Would I still submerge the manzanitas in water, though, without loosening the roots? Yeah, definitely. Suggestions for planting in decomposed granite. Whitney, I will get back to that question. Please type in a little bit more details. I want to know, sometimes like people in the foothill communities, lower mountains, have a soil type that's called decomposed granite, where it's pretty similar. Or you might also be referring to just an area where the mulch layer applied on top is that decomposed granite product. So let me know which situation you're talking about. And then next time we answer questions or at the end of the presentation, we will get back to it. But I do want to keep going pretty quickly because we do have that establishment period to talk about still. And it is almost 11:30 already. We have a lot to cover still, but definitely I will have time for any questions at the end of the presentation. So just wanted to quickly run through another example with a 5-gallon pot. So this is a fig tree. So 5-gallon, 15, whatever, works the same way. With a 5-gallon, I'll do 2 to maybe 3 inches high because there's more soil volume. We might lose more volume. So same thing with the soaking. With the trees, sometimes you do have a more aggressive root circling. So that's why I wanted to show this. So really did have to do some loosening on this to get to that, because this being planted, that tree is not going to get its roots out. It's not going to thrive. So went that far. And now you can see even in our hole though, some of these roots are just too long. So actually doing a little bit of pruning on the roots. You don't want to just rip them. Nice sharp pruners. Any pruning cut on a plant, roots or stems, that actually is surgery. So you want to do a nice clean cut. So that's what we're going to end with, so that the roots can really grow more out in their natural direction. With a 5-gallon pot, you can see here, this area did not have an irrigation system, and just with our schedule, just did not work for us to do that pre-soak of the area. So what I did is backfill halfway, then a good soak, let that, went and did something else, let that soak in, backfill the rest of the way, start to rough out our watering ring, which at least 2 inches for a 5-gallon tree. So it took quite a bit of extra fill soil. And with the fill soil, you can just kind of scrape up some little soil from here and there, or what you can actually do is you can, where the outer layer is going to be, you can kind of dig a secondary trench. And so you can dig what'll be basically a little round trench in the ground, mound that up on this side. And then once that's packed down, what you have is a secondary ring that you can water. So it's up and then down. You can fill both of them as the roots grow out. It will incentivize those roots to grow farther out. And then our soaking. Just a cutaway to show you really what we're talking about here. So level bottom of the hole so that our root ball is high. And then you don't want to leave the root ball just like jutting out of the side. So you're going to use a little soil to kind of tamp this, or to let it fall down. And then we have our area that'll get flooded with the watering ring. And then our berm. And then if you need to dig out soil from nearby, you can actually dig out that little trench on the outside, and that's something else that can be watered. Same thing for a tree. If you are planting a tall tree, you might need to stake it. Staking is usually done wrong. The only thing that you want to do with a stake is to support the tree just enough that it's not going to blow over in the wind. The tree needs to have some flexibility to move around a little bit in the wind, because that's how it's going to build up its strength. Oftentimes you'll see trees that are staked super tight, and that tree will never develop the strength it needs to stand up on its own over time. It becomes very hazardous over time. So if you're planting, usually if you're planting even a 5-gallon tree, if it's a multi-trunk tree, you might not need to stake it. Even that fig tree that I planted, as soon as it went into the ground, I pulled the stake off, kind of shook the trunk a little bit. Oftentimes that 5-gallon tree is going to be able to stand up on its own. Just leave it unless it seems like it's going to be floppy. Sometimes you need to plant a 15-gallon tree if that's the only size you can get it at. Oftentimes those will need to be staked. So you're going to pound 2 stakes into the ground. You're going to need a post pounder to do that. The kind of metal thing you can get at the hardware store where you kind of you put it over the stake and you smack it in the ground. I apologize, I forgot to put a picture of it here. It's called a post pounder. And you'll do it on each side. You're going to make sure, if you have to do it, you do not put it through the root ball of the tree, farther out. And if you're doing it within the planting hole area, you're going to want to make sure that minimum you're getting the stake a foot into the ground. You might need to get it in further. It takes some work. Somebody who's got some strength is really going to need to do this, especially depending on your soil type. And then you will use some sort of tie. And from the landscape supply stores, they have all sorts of different options. And you're going to do it in a kind of light figure 8 around 2 sides of the tree. So it can flex some, but it can't fall all the way over. And so on the right-hand side here, you can see the kind of detail where there's each of these figure 8s. It holds it in the middle, but allows it to flex just a little bit. If you're in an area that's windy, you want to put the stakes in line with the direction of the wind. That will provide the maximum stabilization for the tree while letting it move around some. And you want to do it actually as low on the tree as possible, to where the tree will be stabilized, to where it can't blow over in the wind, but it has some flexibility. So this is very different. Oftentimes, even in commercial sites, these things are way overstaked. It's a big problem in the industry. Training around it is not in a good situation right now. Oftentimes the landscapers who put these in are just doing what they learned from someone else. They're not arborists. So sometimes you see some really bad practices. You never, like the stake right up against the trunk of the tree, that's never what you want to do. So something like this. And then in like a municipal situation, even if a city knows what it's doing, you might see more straps or higher up. That's because they can't constantly be checking on their trees. They have a whole city to cover. They need to make sure things are really secure and they don't have to go back often. To best establish your plant, you really want to put this in pretty low, give it some flex, and then after a year, usually it should be able to stand on its own, and you want to take it off. And so you can see here close up, I like this strapping that doesn't have any flex to it. You get it in a roll. There's kind of pre-cut rubber things you can use that work just fine too. And you can see here are the 2 figure 8s, just holding it enough so that it can't blow over when we get our Santa Ana winds. One other note, Planting on slopes. If you're planting on slopes and you're needing to hand water for a little while, it's a little tricky. So that's why I provided this cutaway. You can plant on an angle if you need to, which minimizes this a little bit, but you're going to still need to do that watering mound, but obviously not on the uphill side, just on the downhill side, because the water is going to level out. So sometimes people will do that full mound all the way around, but the part on the uphill side doesn't do anything. So if you look at it on a bird's eye view, basically your little berm or your little mound is going to kind of make like a boomerang shape, and it will just, the top of it, you want to aim for it to be level. And then it's just going to kind of, where that level hits the slope on the upper side, it's just going to kind of die into the slope. Sometimes it takes a little bit for first timers to get a hang of doing this. And so what you want to do is you'll try it, you'll fill it with water, and you'll make sure it evenly fills. And if you have like a low spot there and it starts overflowing before you want it to, you can touch it up some. So that can be a little tricky. Hopefully those images are helpful. And most important thing is for plantings which will not immediately be on automatic irrigation, you really need to build those watering rings and water deeply right away. Oftentimes I'll build at least a little watering ring to get that first soak in, because that flooding and putting a lot of water there quickly and letting it soak in any loose soil settles down, where you just kind of don't get that with drip or sprinklers. But definitely if you're going to be watering over time by hand, it's absolutely essential to get that good watering ring. And the difference between a good watering ring that really holds a couple inches of water and kind of, you didn't put the effort in, so it only holds like half an inch of water, that can make all the difference in whether or not your plants thrive. Again, like I said, usually we see that people who are hose watering aren't getting their water deep enough when they water. And that good watering ring in that first establishment year is really, really important. And so you can see here are some where we kind of dug that outer ring and then have the inner ring. And in the rainy season over time, sometimes the mounds will start to erode a little bit. So you can see that here. And so you might need to touch them up to make sure that you don't lose that soil depth, especially if you're watering with your hose over time. In that first year, every few months, make sure you take a look at things. You might need to touch things up some. And so you can see here in the rain with our swale dry stream bed in action right after planting. Another thing, if you're watering by hose, you're going to have to be careful with is making sure that you don't break your plants with your hose as you go around. Some of these little 1 gallon buckets that are there are filled with rocks from the site, form little temporary barriers that make us less likely to run our plants over with the hose. And then I didn't get a picture of it from this project on the backyard, but from the front yard, in the areas that were weedier, before we put down wood chip mulch, we did sheet mulching. So using recycled corrugated cardboard. You can also, if you need to, use rolls of brown painter's paper from the hardware store, although the cost could add up on that. And using those as a temporary biodegradable weed barrier to help keep the weeds down. If you are interested in that process, check out our Killing Your Turf the Right Way class on our YouTube channel. On the sheet mulching section, we go way into that, and it works just as well for just general weedy areas that might come back. So some questions have come in. So getting back to Whitney, we had decomposed granite installed in a small side yard where we keep the garbage cans. There are 2 established palms on either side. We eventually want to plant between the 2 palms, so we need to decide on the plants. So with that, yeah, you can absolutely plant into the decomposed granite. It's going to be the exact same thing, like it's as if there was the wood chip mulch, where you're just going to want to make sure that the DG goes to the side, that when you're digging your soil and enough DG is kind of pulled back or dug out that you can really dig your hole, do all your work. When you're digging, you're going to want to make sure that soil comes out into a bucket. I might even lay down some cardboard or something, because it's a pain in the butt to try to get soil off of your clean DG mulch. And then do your planting, and then make sure that you've either adjusted your irrigation system to make sure those plants get water, or you're doing your hand watering. Usually with a DG mulch, the plants are on drip irrigation, because you can't really very effectively hand water overhead with a hose like into decomposed granite. It kind of makes a mess. And the question is, do I need to dig a bigger hole than typical or just treat the area the same as any other soil? I believe we're on clay. Just treat it the same as, so for those, like if you have 2 inches of decomposed granite, so remember your root ball is going to be an inch or 2 high. So what you'll end up with is just a very, very light layer of decomposed granite on top of your root ball, but not inches of it. Or if the plant is already kind of like a mounding plant where you really can't see the root ball, you don't even need decomposed granite right on top of it. So hopefully that will help. And last question. We're using a team of installers to plant a landscape. What is the best way to get them to follow this planting process? Installers seem to want to get the plant in the ground and not plant as you have described. Should I plant my own plants? That is a really good question. Couple of different things you can do. Depends on the size of your yard. If it's doable for you to plant your own plants, then you can obviously make sure that you go through the whole process. If it's not doable, though, it's just not doable. I mean, I definitely have done large commercial jobs where we bring in an outside contractor when I was at the botanical garden. But part of my job was I literally met with the foreman, had the entire crew there, and showed them, for this project, this is how things should be planted. That's the acceptable job. And it took some training and it took some oversight, especially at the beginning, and some corrections with me being very nice and patient, but just explaining. And also for me, it might be different than you. For me, I was in a position to act like the expert. So I would just say, like, for this planting, here's what we're doing. But I would explain to them why. I would explain that we need the good drainage. I would explain to them that the root crown on these plants is prone to rotting. So that, to everyone on the crew, so that me telling them to do it differently is not disrespect. A lot of landscapers, some really do just want to get the job done. But I've known a lot of landscapers that they're interested in those details, but what they have been taught is a good job. Their whole career is knocking it out fast. And none of their supervisors had ever said, here is the science or the biology of why this plant should be planted in this certain way. So not some cases, people haven't been receptive to that. And I've made people redo things and had to keep an eye on them. And in some cases, more often than not, people have been really receptive to it. So, but just to make sure that you're out in front of it, as you are talking to someone before you hire them for the job, maybe even before you settle the price, you might just say, look, this is how I'm going to want things to be planted. That way it's set up ahead of time. This is the expectation for the job. If it takes longer, it takes longer, but this is how it's going to go. So hopefully that is useful. Okay, let's keep going. So continuing with construction, and I'm going to go through a lot of these pretty quickly. I want you to see the process, but then we've kind of talked about a lot of the concepts already. So with that, really starting to continue to develop this terrace. This is March 2019. So we're through that rainy season where we didn't have time to finish all of that work. This is our sunken meadow area. So here, again, these are what are called rose pots, little 2-inch plants that you can get pretty cheaply. This is for our Western meadow sedge, little sunken meadow. And so for this, because we're planting things like just a foot apart and a lot of them, planted smaller, and then, but at the beginning had to check in warm weather, do some hose watering every day until these started to go. And then rapidly as they grew, less often than that. So you can see using a combination of rock from the site and slabs of the concrete to build this little bench. No mortar in any of this, all of this just kind of packing the soil together and in between things, and started to build a couple of terraces. So we have these flat planting areas coming down, which wouldn't be the worst slope, but having these flat planting areas really made things a lot easier to water things in. As the plants have grown, you don't even see a lot of this rock work. Maybe I shouldn't have spent much time on it, but it looked very nice at the beginning. And you get glimpses of it somewhere. You continue to see this. And so you can see doing that work to make that terrace. And then after the planting comes mulch, which is very important. Mulch is really a word for anything that covers the soil. In a hot, dry area, covering the soil prevents the evaporation of soil moisture, which is very important. Also for our California native and our Mediterranean plants as well, things like lavender. It keeps the soil cooler. And that's very, very important, whether it's a wood chip mulch or decomposed granite or gravel. It shades the soil. It helps keep the soil cooler because these plants, a lot of them are ones that they evolved in areas where they don't get any moisture in the summer, none at all. And in our gardens, though, even after the first year during establishment, but even after establishment, we still might give them a good deep soak for most plants once a month, because up in the mountains, they might go dormant and look half dead or pretty much dead as their way to respond to the summer heat. In our home gardens, we often want things to look a little nicer, flower for longer. But these plants have never evolved to where they really have that moisture all throughout the year, unless we're really planting like desert plants that get summer thunderstorms. Our local or most of our California native Mediterranean climate plants don't have that. And they can get into trouble with soil pathogens that they never evolved to have to deal with if they have too much exposure to warm, wet soil. So that mulch layer helps keep that soil cool, which can be very important, especially during establishment, where we're going to be watering like once a week for our new plant. So what type of mulch should you use? Well, if you are planting like a native woodland, you can use wood chips. That kind of mimics the leaf litter that a woodland has. If you're doing a real kind of chaparral or a desert planting, then a combination of gravel, rocks, and maybe some areas with wood chip is nice. And then often what I'll do, even for my mixed native, like chaparral, sages, some desert plants, is because it's available, often free and easy to get going, I will lay out like 2 inches of wood chip mulch around my plantings that first season. And then as the plants grow, they're going to shade themselves. Eventually they'll drop some of their own leaves. So I'll never have to replace that. I'm not trying to make a real thick, deep layer of organic matter. I'm trying to cover the soil, prevent some weed growth, keep it cool that first year. And then the areas that are still going to be a little bit open, I'll mix in very naturalistically, like some gravels and some rocks and things like that. But then after that first kind of one and done of that wood chip planting, I'm normally only bringing in wood chips for like my pathways or things like that. So here's wood chip mulch. If you're local to us, Waterwise Community Center, we give away free wood chip mulch. It's the stuff that I use at home usually as well. And currently that's just available in a pile in our parking lot at our facility in Montclair. We have mulch and compost. Come whenever you want. We just ask that you wear a mask, and you're going to load it yourself with whatever tools or containers or just into the back of your truck. And we ask that you stay distance at least 10 feet from other people. But because it's available in our parking lot all the time, usually there's only at any one time like 1 or 2 cars picking stuff up. And then here's an example of the gravel that I'll generally like to use. I'll always use, I think this is a really nice example, just our local stone. The ornamental gravels that you get in the bag, once you do a landscape this large, usually look really weird and kind of fake, and they're expensive, and you can only get them in one size. And so if you work with like our local river rock, which is our local stuff in this area, you can say, I'm going to do in this case mostly pea gravel, and then I'll mix in some larger cobble, and then I'll mix in some larger stone in the dry stream bed, and maybe 1 or 2 boulders. And then over here, they have decomposed granite, but still with a few bits of rock in it. I think this is absolutely lovely. This is a homeowner, first garden. Obviously, he has a great eye in Rancho Cucamonga, so local to us. He showed me his garden, and I just thought this was lovely. So I asked if I can share this. And so here you can see things starting to grow in. These are wildflowers, so it looks kind of weedy, but the color will be coming. You can see the stepping stones starting to show up, the wood chip mulch. And over time, we've added more stone in between the plants as they've grown. But just starting, you can see we're working on sheet mulching areas as we go, especially the pathways. We just didn't have time to do it all. So got the planting areas taken care of first, hitting the pathways every few weeks with a string trimmer so the weed seeds don't spread, and then sheet mulching. You can see here, even now, the dry season again, we're slowly building out the bridge across. Built this shade structure just because this area was really, really blasted with sun. But then for the concrete footings, just using the same materials, covering things up with just some of the gravel. You can see things starting to grow in. This is in May. Continuing to mix in some stone details. So this is September. So you can see this, here's that 1 gallon tree that I was kind of standing pretending to be. And so still a lot of growing to do. And this is just kind of the reality of DIY projects. Still hadn't finished all the stonework in the swale, but the shrubs are starting to grow in. You still can't see really the design intent yet, but there's progress. Still don't have the site all mulched, but it's a project in progress. Still starting to see some nice color contrast and some nice colors. So this is the first fall when we had planted that previous winter. And so that October, it's kind of starting to feel like a garden. You can see the shrubs around that broken concrete area. And we, for the backyard, we're just going for a very naturalistic, loose, informal feel. Weren't worried about it being too neat or orderly or anything. Meadow is starting to grow in. Still can't see, the tree here is just barely starting to grow. And then starting to do that mulch pathway, just kind of mixing in gravels and branches and things like that. These are dried wildflowers, which don't look very nice, but are filled with seeds that bring lots and lots of songbirds around. For talk about how to do that, we have a whole workshop online on our YouTube channel about gardening for songbirds and butterflies and pollinators as well. So you can see here, this area, you can see the trench has widened, starting to fill it with gravel. So starting with just that 1.5 inch gravel as the main, and then mixing in over time. So you can see this is where it was going with those stepping stones to let the water go through, and the gravel filled in. So we can even put a wheelbarrow over this. It's really easy to walk across. Kind of looks a little more interesting, and the waters can just flow right through. And then bringing in our other size of stone and kind of slowly starting to work it in. Working in some gravel around the edge of the concrete as well to start to blend it with the garden. This is an area where a few of the plants that we planted here just didn't work out first time around. So we're going to be replanting this fall, which is realistic, just kind of happens sometimes. And then here, this is spring of this year. So this is now the second spring. So we planted in the winter. There's that first spring where things were starting to grow. And now the next spring, things are really going. All of a sudden it is a garden. So that spacing plants out, giving them the room to grow, it's important after a year. You can see wildflowers, our shrubs, little details, native dudleas, our California native succulent worked in at the bottom of this stone and broken concrete wall, really starting to get some nice color. In the front yard, added the native plants live here sign from California Native Plant Society, letting our neighbors know what's going on. And you can see sun's not great in all these pictures, but really starting to work more with the different sizes of rock, finishing that bridge that just goes over to our mulched paths so the water can go underneath. Stuff growing in around our bird bath. This is a small bird bath, and then to raise it, we just put it up on a cinder block and surrounded it with some of the smaller pieces of broken concrete. Birds visit all the time throughout the day. Here is our broken concrete patio. Our wildflowers from the previous season seeded and grew all in the cracks of the broken concrete patio, which was kind of crazy, but it was really, really beautiful. Just a pleasure to be in. And the life is showing up. So again, we're not going to talk too much about pollinators and butterflies, but they're coming. And so this is May going into the warm season, meadow really starting to grow in, and all of it really starting to come together. So all that hard work doing the grading, working with the stone, really starting to pay off. And you can see there's still areas, like here's an area where we just didn't finish the stonework. You can still see in this area, we did have some weeds, so we just put down some of that painter's paper from the hardware store. it's a process, but especially late June this year, really starting to come together and feel like a garden. Working more with evening out the different sizes of the stone in the widest part of the dry stream bed. And here's September of this year. Lighting is kind of crazy because the fires were going on, but even past the peak of summer, a lot of color, a lot of life. So in the last few minutes, we're going to talk about establishment, which is not rocket science, but doing the basics is all you need to do to really make things go. So then we'll have plenty of time for questions after that. So establishment, one of the first things, no matter how good you do your weed abatement, take out your lawn, whatever kind of mulch you use, whatever you do to kill your lawn, critical job the first year is to be on the lookout for weeds or regrowing grasses, especially if you removed a lawn that had Bermuda grass. So here's kind of what you're going to start seeing are things like this. Bermuda grass, where it transitions to, in this case, our kind of crummy shaped asphalt driveway. There's going to be living Bermuda grass roots underneath. So it's going to try to pop back up. Not everywhere, but it'll be coming up here and there in the garden, even though we fully sheet mulched this and dug stuff out in different areas. And so first year, I say weed patrol once a week. If you are doing it once a week and just quickly digging out, that hoary knife is the real thing that I like to use, then you will not have to spend that much time on it generally. But if you leave this for 4 weeks and it continues to spread, you're in for a lot of work. So first year, weed patrol once a week, whether it's you or whether it's a gardener. I know some people where when they do this, they might no longer hire the guy who has been mowing their lawn for years to do like care and maintenance. But oftentimes if you talk to that person and say, what would you charge me when you're in the neighborhood mowing the neighbor's lawn to come and deal with pulling some weeds once a week? If you're not up for doing that yourself and you have the budget for that, sometimes that transition is going to be just fine. Oftentimes the mow and blow people are not going to know the skills to care for the plants and do the pruning. Some of them you can show them what to do and they'll be just fine at it. Depends on what they're interested in and their experience. But the basic weeding or sometimes spreading some more mulch, definitely. So not quite sure how that slide made it in there. Got copied by accident. So note on selecting the best plants at the nursery. We're going to go through this really quickly. Later on, I believe in December, there's going to be a whole class on selecting and planting plants. So really even zooming in more. But I wanted to include it some because a lot of people are going to start planting in November, and I didn't want to skip this information. So we'll go through it pretty quickly. When you're at the nursery, you want to select relatively small, healthy, vigorous looking plants. Buy 1 gallon plants unless you have a specific reason not to. And don't be afraid to leave a nursery without the plant you were looking for. If they only have them, then they're overgrown and in bad health. Better to come up with the substitute rather than planting a plant that's not healthy. So here's an example of sometimes you actually at Home Depot can find some Waterwise plants. This is one of my favorite small perennial plants. It's Margarita Bop Penstemon, California native. That's a good price for a 2-gallon plant. But it's crazy to plant this as a 2-gallon plant. You can plant it as a 1-gallon plant, pay less, it'll plant easier, and it's going to be healthier in the long run. So here's an example of some different plants to look at. You see how thick the stems are on these 2 sages on the left? That's an indicator that they've been in that pot for too long. So even though this one's going to be taller than one that's in good health, it's not the one to get. At the nursery, you absolutely can gently tease the root ball out of the pot if you're thinking it might be overgrown. Chances are the roots are going to be circling, so it'll come out. And then if there's a lot of circling roots, just don't buy it. So of these, here you can see here, like there's a lot of flowers that have faded and there's kind of some brown. This has probably been in for too long as well. This one on the right, this is about perfect. Proportional amount of leaf mass on the top to the bottom. Sometimes you have to get them a little bit bigger, but this is kind of right what I'm looking for. What sometimes people would consider undergrown, but this is perfect. So you can see, if you tease it out and you see this or that, skip that plant. That's never gonna grow really healthily. That's to me is perfect. And sometimes, like our other example, you'll have to get them with more roots, but definitely not that. Roots can be different colors. So here they're brown, sometimes they'll be lighter. So there's just a range. This, way overgrown. These are on the box truck that was delivering my wholesale order, and you can see they stayed on the truck, got sent back for a rebate. I was pretty upset that the nursery even sent me those. Other things you might see with overgrown plants, definitely overgrown. You see here, this white could be beneficial fungus, but if you look inside and you see things that are almost like little grains of rice, sometimes moving around, that's root mealybug. Throw away that plant, and in fact, put it in a black plastic bag in 2 layers and throw it away. It's an insect that infects roots, and you don't want to put it into your garden. So I'm always checking my root balls before I plant, usually before I buy as well. So last few notes on establishment. We're going to talk quickly about what is establishment, a little bit about watering, weeding. We'll have some slides about pest control. We're not going to have time to go over all the pest control slides, but they'll be here if you want to download the slides as a reference. And then again, as a reference, a little bit of early pruning and shaping. Excuse me. So what is establishment? Establishment is the early phase of a new planting where we transition our plants from a sheltered life in a pot in a nursery to a happy and healthy life in their new home. It's no set amount of time because it's based on how the plant starts growing in, but often I find in our nice valley soils in Southern California, if you're in the inland valley areas, it's about a year. Sometimes it's 2 years if things sometimes start growing a little slower in clay soils, but a year or two. Basically, you will know that plant has put on a good spurt of growth. It's looking like a small version of a mature plant and not an awkward young plant. Establishment, watering, proper watering is the key. People tend to overthink Waterwise plants, so it's not complicated. But basically, you can't let the root ball dry out too much when it's getting established. But you don't want to like water it every day. You don't want to water it 3 times a week. You want to, in general, in Southern California for establishment, in full sun, in general, you want to water once a week. And when you water, water deeply. As it starts to grow, you want to water both where the roots are and a little bit farther out where you want them to grow. So if you have an irrigation system, in general, that first warm season, you want to apply about 1 inch of water about once a week. So in an overhead irrigation system, if you have an existing one, you can literally put out a bunch of cat food cans, tuna cans, or I like wide mouth pint mason jars that are just basically a glass like cylinder that's open at the top. Run your irrigation system till those whatever canister you put out has 1 inch of water in it. That's how long you need to water it. Run it once a week. If you have a drip system, that's one of the reasons why I encourage people to put that drip grid in, because if you install it at a certain spacing, then you can know how you're going to get 1 inch of water. And we go into all of that in all of our drip irrigation classes. So you can refer to these just as references. We're not going to have time to go over all of these slides, but we explain all of this in depth in both our turf to Waterwise landscape irrigation class and in our drip irrigation classes as well. So I wasn't quite sure if we were going to have time. We don't have time, but check out those other classes and we go way into it. If you are hose watering, this is going to be one of the last things we talk about. Critical. Invest in a decent watering wand. Now you could do something like this that's kind of commercial grade that will last a long time, spend up to $60. This assembly, which you can get at Home Depot, a common brand that makes really good stuff is Dram. Some of their stuff is really cheap too, but this is one that all of this together costs about $30. That'll do it for most people. It's about a 2-foot metal tube, which makes it easier to reach and do the water. It's a little valve where you can adjust the flow or turn it off. And it's the piece on the end is called a breaker. And notice on all these breakers, whether it's plastic on the rim or metal, see all of these, you get a nice shower effect, but you see all of these holes over the whole surface. If you're doing serious watering, don't use this multi-click, 9 or 12 different adjustable things. These are great for washing cars, but when you put it on the shower, it's only one ring of holes on the edge. So when you're trying to water a whole garden, it's going to take forever. That's why you need something like this. If you're not using an automatic irrigation system, to figure out how to put down that equivalent of an inch of water as things are growing in. Well, when things are small, just fill that watering ring 2 to 3 times. As things grow in, to apply the equivalent of 1 inch of water, on the left side is the width of the plant in diameter. On the right side is the number of gallons it takes. And so what you would do, here I just have a hose. So with your watering wand attached, set up to the rate, if you have it all the way open or partway closed, however you actually like to water. See how long it takes to fill up a 5-gallon bucket, divide it by 5. That's the amount of time you need to have that hose going at that setting to apply a gallon of water. And then you can figure out how many minutes each plant is going to need. It's going to be more than most people think. So for the weeds, we already kind of talked about this. And these are that's that top weeding tool, that Hori Hori. I see it's gotten past 12. We are almost done. Thank you for sticking with us. It's the first time we've taught this as an online only class, so a little bit of guesswork in terms of the timing. So this is something you can buy online. There's some really crummy knockoff brands available of this that are just not good tools these days. So these 4 brands, the tool, I think they're made by the same factory. The tool is almost exactly the same. Those are all going to be a good quality product. You want to get the stainless steel version because it won't rust. Super useful for all sorts of gardening tasks. And then if you haven't mulched yet and you just have lots of little weeds coming up, a stirrup hoe, which you just kind of go back and forth right at the surface of the soil, is a really efficient tool as well. So then I'm going to finish it up. But here what we have for both weeds, if you download the slides at cbwcd.org/presentations, have a guide for the common weeds that you might find, as well as talking a little bit about beneficial insects, as well as the most common pests that might show up. Just one by one, for example, scale, here's what it'll look like. Here's what to do about it for an ecologically sensitive way of controlling it in the garden. You may or may not have these issues, but just want to provide you with this guide in case you do. And then finally, some early pruning or shaping tips. I'm not going to go through these slide by slide because I will end on the main resource that you will want for how to do both your establishment pruning, if you need to do it, some plants don't need it, or your ongoing care. If you go to inlandvalleygardenplanner.org, this is our resource for learning about Waterwise plants, detailed plant profiles on our top 350 Waterwise plants for Southern California. And each one of these has detailed maintenance information. So we encourage you to use this to go through multiple criteria to figure out the plants you want for your plan. But also, each one of these plants has detailed care information. In the coming years, we're going to be trying to do a lot of videos about care as well and getting them up on YouTube. And so even for some of the stuff where we might not have, for example, for California natives, all the manzanitas, we just have the top easiest to grow ones. But if you're an enthusiast and you want to get other stuff, the maintenance is going to be the same. So check out all of these maintenance guides, and that will really be what you need. So for example, if you read right after you plant or before you plant all of it, some of them will have tips for setting things up for good long-term structure the first year. If they don't, it's not that important. Some of them, you might not need to do many maintenance until a number of years on. So that is the presentation. Really quickly, as we end, I'm going to launch our closing poll. If before you log out, you can please fill out our closing poll. We'd really appreciate it. It's just, I think, 4 questions. And so it'll only take you a moment. And then I am here for questions and answers. So we'd really appreciate it if you fill this out. Helps us out a lot. And then also, in addition to any questions you might have, if you can give us any comments in the chat, I'd appreciate it. This is the first time that we have taught this as an online only presentation. Normally, this is something where we teach at least half the presentation outdoors in our demonstration garden, which we are not doing right now because of COVID. It's nice to teach certain things online because people can join us from much farther away. But I want to check in with you and see how things work talking about this stuff, showing it all as pictures on a computer screen. So if there's things that worked for you or were useful, I'd really like to know. And then also if there's things that weren't clear, maybe they need more time spent on them. So we should break them out into doing another dedicated class or more YouTube content. Please let us know in the chat. We'd really appreciate any feedback since it's the first time we've taught this in quite this way. And yeah, if there's any other questions, please send them in. We don't have any right now, but I will keep an eye on them and answer anything that comes in. And for those of you who are going to be, oh, I see a question from Charlie, so I'll answer that. And for those of you who are going to head out after who don't have questions, oh my gosh, I see that the closing poll is not allowing for multiple responses for question 4. I must have set that up wrong, so I apologize. So that's not a big deal. Just fill out whichever one you want. So we'll answer some questions for those of you who are going to head out. Thank you so much for joining us, and check out our upcoming workshops or our YouTube recordings of other workshops, or sign up for our newsletter. And I will end with the, I will reshare the links to all of the other online sources we talked about right before I get to the questions. Okay, so here's the links. So getting back to the questions from Charlie. Regarding mulch settlement over time, I noticed your front yard you planted before sheet mulching. In the backyard you planted afterwards. After planting with the soaking ring berm and after the first year of establishment, should the mulch be kept away from the plants to prevent stem rot? What is the radius we want to keep around established plants? Awesome question, Charlie. Yeah, so when you are mulching, in general, I will, for most things, I will not in the first, I guess, number of weeks or even couple of months, unless we have a real heat wave. So what I like to plant in the fall is normally I won't mulch the actual watering ring, because when you do that, the mulch kind of floats up and it kind of resettles down, and sometimes it settles right at the base of the plant. And you never want your mulch to go right at the base of the plant. So I'm glad that you mentioned this, Charlie. Ideally, at least when plants are young, even if you don't have watering rings or you knock your watering rings down because the overhead irrigation system has taken over, the drip system, ideally at least 3 inches minimum away from the base of a plant from where the stems hit the ground. 6 is not bad. I'll often go for a little bit farther out because the plants will get going pretty quickly. So 6 inches out. You don't want to have too much mulch accumulated at the base of the plant or right up against it, because again, that can hold moisture even after a rain, and that area is the area prone to rot. And it is, mulch kind of moves around over time, and even as your Waterwise plants just drop leaves over time, If you're going to be doing summer watering, which is most of us, every few years, it's really useful to, at the base of your shrubs, just kind of rake out some of the leaves just away from the very base of the plant to make sure that there's not too much leaf litter or mulch accumulated within that like 6 inches underneath the canopy away from the stem. Just make sure you have really good air circulation there. If you're using decomposed granite for your mulch, you can bring it into about 3 inches or so, and then it tends to stay there. Same thing for gravel. Great question, Charlie. Let's see what else. So John, about agaves and aloes. Do agaves and aloes also need to be non-pot bound when purchased? Great question. Not as important. You can be, just because when you plant them, you don't want them to be pot bound or have those circling roots. But agaves and aloes are so tough and regrow roots so rapidly that if you need to be, you can be really rough on ripping apart those circling roots. Really, all aloes or agaves need is just a little bit of root on them to reroot. So if you have a choice between a pot bound and a not pot bound one, go for the not pot bound one. But it's a great point, and I will try to remember to mention it in future classes, is that they are pretty flexible because you can really go at them with the hori-hori or whatever tool you're using and loosen them up as much as you need to without damaging them. So I think, let's see. We had a question come in, a couple of questions come in on the comments, which we can answer. Let's see, from RBAYARD. Sorry if I didn't pronounce your name, Rabayard. Hope I pronounced it correctly. Would you recommend that a redbud tree that was planted 2 years ago but is not thriving be dug up and replanted? The soil is very compacted, and it appears that there is not a way for roots to move through the soil. Tree is 6 to 8 feet tall. A couple of things. So depending on the size the redbud was planted, they can take a couple of years to get going sometimes. I've had redbuds absolutely just shoot off, and then I've also had redbuds take a while. So in my yard, for example, so redbud in the front yard and redbud in the backyard. Redbud in the front yard got going right away, and these plants came from the same nursery, planted the same way. The one in the backyard is growing, but it's taking, it took probably 1.5 years longer to really start its growth spurt. So it might not be something to give up on. Redbuds, you're not going to be successful digging it up and replanting it. I will still loosen the roots on redbud, but redbuds are a legume, and that whole family of plants is pretty sensitive to root disturbance. So to be quite honest, if it's to that point, you'd want to remove it and just start again with a new redbud if you think that that's a good choice for that area. If the soil is that compacted, a couple of things you might want to try if you are replanting. One thing, although for nutrient, I don't recommend compost for native plants, and I wouldn't recommend you necessarily put it in the hole, other than maybe just a little bit if you have compacted clay soil, like we talked about for the transition. But doing a 1 to 2 inch layer of compost around the whole area where it's going to be growing, and then covering it with wood chip mulch, can add some organic matter to the soil over time. The earthworms might bring it in. It re-enlivens some of the soil biology, which over a few years can help result in some soil structure development and decompaction. So that's something you might try. And then also to plant like an individual tree or large shrub, that's going to be important. Sometimes what I'll do is, in addition to the hole I dig for the shrub, I will take a mattock, so like a pick, and kind of in like a radiating, almost like a drawn out like sun pattern. So starting from the hole, I will make kind of loose trenches with just broken up soil with that pick, going however many feet out, maybe 4 feet out in any direction, coming out from 6, 8 different spots in the hole. And then I'm not creating real trenches. I'm leaving that soil in there. If it's really heavy clay soil, you can mix in maybe just a little compost again for that transition zone. But those are just areas where physically the roots can grow through a little bit more. So those are some things that you can try. And then the other thing I would ask is, how is it watered? Because if it's being hand watered, or even just the watering patterns, you really want to make sure for that establishment and to get things going that it's getting that occasional but very deep soak, and make sure that, especially in the compacted soil, sometimes the water isn't penetrating down that like foot or so it needs to get to really give the root zone a good watering. And if when you're watering, you're not really getting that penetration, then that's going to stunt the plant and prevent it from really taking off. So definitely check with a shovel right outside the root zone if you need to, or what you think is the current root zone. Make sure that that water is penetrating. So then other question, do I have any tips on growing a floss tree or bush and ceanothus? Have killed at least 6 to 8 of these plants. If you are still with us, will you please quickly type in where you live? And that will help me give you guidance on the ceanothus, because my go-to advice will be dependent on where you live. Santa Clarita, okay, that's useful. And then the floss tree, are we talking about the African silk floss tree or bush? Or I think there is a California native plant that's a Garia. And I think, okay, so the ceanothus, couple of things. Ceanothus have seemed over the last, I'll say 8 years or so, to have become a little bit harder to grow in gardens in hot inland areas like Santa Clarita, like Pomona, where I live, like the San Gabriel Valley, where I worked before I came out here. We have ceanothus that are adapted to those really, really hot, dry climates in our local mountains. And a lot of those ceanothus are really hard to grow in the gardens because they're very hard to get established in a home garden, especially those first couple of years. They are one of the plants where they are locally, our local species of ceanothus don't want any summer water. They are really sensitive. If they get wet roots in the summer, they are very sensitive to soil pathogens and tend to up and die, which makes them very tricky to get established in a home garden, because you put that 1 gallon pot in the ground, and if you don't water it, it will die. But if you water it, it also might die. And so most of the ceanothus that people have, I would say that the average gardener who's not really like learned the hard way, has kind of become a native plant expert, most of the ceanothus that the average gardener is going to have any luck with are not going to be our local ceanothus. They're going to be ceanothus that come from a little bit more coastal areas, because those ceanothus are used to the fog belt, and they can actually tolerate a little bit more summer moisture. So in terms of this, my kind of go-to ceanothus to even attempt to grow, mid-sized shrub, concha is my favorite ceanothus. Large size shrub, Ray Hartman is my favorite ceanothus. And then for like a ground cover, Yankee Point is the go-to. However, I will also say that in the last 7 years or so, with some of the peak heats that we've had, our summers have gotten a little bit more like humid as well. Some of those tried and true varieties are also difficult to grow. Probably about 6 years ago, I was having trouble with some of the plantings I had in some of the ones that were the tried and true. And I talked to the people who I consider to be experts and know more than I do. And they had confirmed some of the same things. And so in inland heat right now, I will only plant ceanothus either in part shade or afternoon shade. I will not plant ceanothus where it gets full sun in the afternoon. And like in our demonstration garden at the Waterwise Community Center, in our last series of heat waves, we had two ceanothus concha bushes on the same irrigation zone, kind of same large planting bed, same soil conditions, the one that got western sun up and quickly died, and the one that's more towards the edge of the canopy of an oak tree in part shade lived. So that's my advice. Only plant ceanothus if you're going to try it, where it's going to get at least afternoon shade, if not dappled shade. The floss tree, those are normally really tough. They do go deciduous in part of the summer. They will lose their leaves. So that doesn't necessarily mean it's dead. You might know that it's dead, but if it, with the silk tree, if it loses its leaves, with your fingernail or with a knife, gently scrape one of the like small diameter branches and see if the stem is truly dead. Right after you get underneath the bark, there'll be the layer called the cambium. So just gently scrape it. And if the leaves have been lost, but that layer is still green, it just might be temporarily dormant and it might releaf. But the number one thing is going to be same thing for that establishment watering. And over time, when you're watering, you really want to make sure you're getting that deep soak. You're going to want to dig down right outside the root zone and confirm that the water, the zone that's wet is at least a foot deep. And then you're going to want to wait in between. So in that establishment period, you're still going to, even in the heat of summer, you're still going to wait like a week and then another deep soak. So hopefully that is useful. And I think that has gotten us through all of the questions. So with that, thank you for joining us, everybody. Hope you join us again. And if you have any more questions, send them in. But if not, we will conclude the workshop.